The first call came at 10:47 p.m. The second came less than a minute later. Then another. And another. By 11:15 my phone screen looked like it was having a seizure. 23 missed calls. 14 voicemails. 37 text messages. All from the same man. The same man who just hours earlier had told me never to contact him again. The same man who had written, "Don't call or come over again, we're done. And don't even think about the will, sweetie." I remember sitting on my back porch in North Carolina, still wearing my Army uniform pants and a faded gray t-shirt, staring at the endless notifications lighting up my screen. The night air smelled like wet grass. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked. And for the first time in years I laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because I finally understood something. My father thought he had just won. What he didn't know was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. And before midnight he was going to realize it. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 38 years old. I'm a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. For almost 20 years I believed that if I worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, and loved my family enough, eventually my father would see me. Not my rank. Not my accomplishments. Not the money I quietly spent helping them. Me. I was wrong. The strange thing about favoritism is that the favored child often doesn't notice it. But the other child notices every single time. Every birthday. Every holiday. Every family gathering. Every conversation. I noticed all of them. My older brother Ryan was 3 years older than me. Growing up, he could do no wrong. If Ryan got a C, Dad said school was unfair. If I got an A, Dad asked why it wasn't an A+. If Ryan crashed a car, it was bad luck. If I forgot to call for 2 days during military training, I was selfish. The rules were always different. The older I got, the more obvious it became. My father never hated me. That would have almost been easier. He simply valued Ryan more. And somehow that hurt worse. When I enlisted at 18, Dad acted as though I had personally betrayed him. "You're throwing your life away," he told me. "You could work with family." I still remember standing in our driveway with a duffel bag over my shoulder. "I need to do this." "No," he said. "You want to do this." Those words stayed with me for years. Because he was right. I did want it. I wanted purpose. I wanted challenge. I wanted a life bigger than our small town. The Army gave me all of that. It also taught me something my father never did. Respect has to be earned. Over the years, I deployed overseas multiple times, missed holidays, missed birthdays, missed weddings. I spent anniversaries sleeping in tents and Christmas mornings in combat zones. But every time I came home, I tried to reconnect with my family, especially my parents. I called every week, sent gifts, visited whenever I could. And when money became a problem, I helped. Quietly, without asking for recognition. When Mom needed surgery, I paid the portion insurance didn't cover. When the roof leaked, I wrote a check. When Dad's truck died, I replaced it. Every single time they accepted the help, but gratitude never lasted long, especially with Dad. Because somehow Ryan always needed more. Ryan was 50 kinds of charming and 1 kind of irresponsible. Businesses failed. Jobs disappeared. Relationships exploded. Credit cards maxed out. Yet every disaster somehow became somebody else's fault. And every time he fell, Dad rushed to catch him. The rest of us were expected to applaud. 3 weeks before everything fell apart, Dad called a family meeting. That alone was unusual. Dad hated family meetings. According to him, families should simply listen, not discuss, not debate. Listen. I drove 3 hours to attend. When I arrived, Ryan was already there. Mom looked nervous. Dad looked determined, which meant trouble. Dinner barely lasted 15 minutes before he got to the point. "I've made some decisions about the future." Nobody spoke. Dad folded his hands. "The estate will go to Ryan." Just like that. No explanation. No discussion. Ryan smirked. Mom stared at her plate. I felt something cold settle in my chest. "Everything I asked." Dad nodded. "Everything." I sat quietly for a moment. Then asked the question nobody else would. "Why?" His jaw tightened. "Because he needs it." I almost laughed. Ryan was 41 years old, not 14. He needs it because he keeps making terrible decisions. Dad slammed his palm on the table. "There you go." "There I go, what?" "Judging your brother." I stared at him. "Dad, you've paid his debts for 20 years. He's family. So am I." The room went silent. Dad looked away first. That hurt more than anything he could have said, because it answered the question. So I stood, picked up my keys, and left. The next morning I woke up to the text. No phone call. No conversation. No attempt to fix things. Just words. Cold. Final. Don't call or come over again. We're done. And don't even think about the will, sweetie. Sweetie. That word annoyed me more than the rest. Like I was still 10 years old. Like he was dismissing me with a pat on the head. I read it twice, then smiled, and replied, "Yes, sir. Nothing else. No argument. No defense. No anger. Just 2 words." Then I put my phone down. For the first time in my life, I stopped chasing my father's approval. The silence that followed felt strange, almost uncomfortable, then surprisingly peaceful. I spent the rest of the day cleaning my house, organizing closets, sorting paperwork, doing all the small tasks people ignore when they're emotionally exhausted. Late that afternoon, I opened a storage box I hadn't touched in years. Most of it contained military records, old photographs, letters from deployments, memories. Then I found a large yellow envelope. My stomach tightened instantly. I knew exactly what it was. The envelope my grandfather had given me 15 years earlier. The one he told me never to lose. The one I had promised to keep safe. I sat down slowly. Outside rain tapped softly against the windows. For several moments I simply stared at the envelope resting in my lap. I hadn't opened it in years. Hadn't even thought about it recently. But now something felt different. Something felt important. Almost urgent. I ran my fingers across Grandpa's handwriting. My chest tightened with memories. Of fishing trips, Sunday breakfasts, long talks on his porch. He had always understood me in a way nobody else did, especially my father. And suddenly I remembered something he had told me during our final conversation. One sentence, one warning. At the time it had seemed strange. Now it felt like a message waiting to be understood. I looked at the envelope again. Then at the growing pile of missed calls beginning to appear on my phone. The first few were from Mom, then Ryan, then Dad, again. And again, and again. I didn't answer. Instead, I carefully opened the envelope. And what I found inside made me realize my father had absolutely no idea what was about to happen. The envelope smelled faintly of old paper and cedar wood. For a moment, I was no longer sitting alone in my house. I was 23 years old again, standing beside my grandfather's hospital bed. The memory arrived so vividly that I could almost hear the steady beep of the heart monitor. Almost feel the cold hospital air against my skin. Back then, I had just finished officer candidate school. I was young, determined, and convinced that hard work could solve almost anything. My grandfather had asked everyone else to leave the room. My father, my mother, Ryan, even the nurses. When the door closed, he motioned for me to come closer. His hands looked thinner than I remembered. Age and illness had taken their toll, but his eyes were still sharp, still strong, still the eyes of a man who had spent his life building something that mattered. "Emily," he said quietly. "Yes, Grandpa. There's something I need you to do for me." I remember pulling a chair closer. "You name it." A faint smile crossed his face. "You always say that." "Because I mean it." For several seconds, he simply looked at me. Then he reached into the drawer beside his bed and removed a large yellow envelope. The same envelope now sitting in my hands 15 years later. "I want you to keep this." "What is it?" "You'll know when the time comes." I laughed softly. "That sounds mysterious." "It is." The smile disappeared. His expression turned serious. "Very serious?" Then he said something I never forgot. "One day your father's choices will destroy this family." At the time, I thought the medication was affecting him. My father and grandfather had always argued. Nothing unusual there. But now, 15 years later, those words echoed differently. Like a warning. Like a prediction. Like a man who knew exactly what was coming. Back in the present, I carefully removed the documents from the envelope. The first several pages looked familiar. Property records, tax filings, business agreements. Nothing dramatic, at least not at first glance. I kept reading, page after page. My military training had taught me patience. Details matter. Small things become big things when people ignore them. By the 20th page, I stopped breathing for a second. Then I read the paragraph again, and again. Because surely I had misunderstood. But I hadn't. The family land wasn't legally my father's. Not completely. In fact, a large portion of what everyone referred to as Dad's property had never actually belonged to him. The ownership structure was far more complicated. Grandpa had established a family trust decades earlier. Most of the assets had been transferred into that trust. Dad had been named trustee, manager, caretaker, not owner. That distinction changed everything. I leaned back in my chair. Outside rain continued falling against the windows. Inside, my heartbeat felt louder than the storm. I kept reading. The deeper I went, the more uncomfortable I became. because suddenly dozens of events from the past 20 years started making sense. Dad had always acted like the family assets belonged to him. Completely. Absolutely. But legally that wasn't true. His authority came with conditions, responsibilities, restrictions. And according to these documents, Grandpa had been extremely specific. One clause immediately caught my attention. I read it 3 times, then a 4th. The language was clear. If the trustee used family assets primarily to benefit one heir at the expense of others, if the trustee violated fiduciary responsibilities, if the trustee demonstrated favoritism that endangered the long-term interests of the family trust, then oversight authority could be transferred, not automatically, but through legal review. I stared at the name listed beneath that clause. My name, Emily Carter. For several moments I simply sat there, motionless. The room suddenly felt smaller. I wasn't shocked because I might inherit something. I genuinely didn't care about the money. What shocked me was that Grandpa had anticipated this exact situation 15 years ago, long before the latest fight, long before the text message, long before tonight. He had seen something everyone else ignored. Something I had spent years pretending wasn't real. My father's favoritism. I closed my eyes, and memories came flooding back. Ryan's failed construction company. Dad using family funds to bail him out. Ryan's second business. Another rescue. Ryan's divorce. Dad paying legal fees. Ryan's tax problems. Dad handling those too. Every crisis. Every mistake. Every bailout. At the time I dismissed it as parental loyalty. Now I wasn't so sure. I turned another page, then another. My stomach dropped. There were financial summaries, detailed ones. Grandpa had apparently ordered independent audits during the final years of his life. Several notes had been attached, handwritten, meticulous, concerned. One note stood out. Repeated transfers without proportional benefit to trust beneficiaries. Another, excessive support provided to Ryan Carter. And another, potential future risk if pattern continues. I rubbed my forehead. This wasn't just favoritism. This was documentation. Evidence. Years of it. Suddenly my phone buzzed again. Dad. Calling. I let it ring. Then another call. Ryan. Ignored. Then Mom. Ignored. For the first time in my life, I wasn't interested in defending myself. I wanted answers. At nearly midnight, I found the final section. A sealed letter addressed specifically to me. My hands shook slightly as I unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakably Grandpa's. Emily, if you're reading this, then one of 2 things has happened. Either your father finally learned fairness, or he didn't. I smiled despite myself. That sounded exactly like him. I kept reading. You will be tempted to protect people who refuse to protect you. You always have been. That is one of your greatest strengths, and one of your greatest weaknesses. The words hit harder than I expected, because they were true, painfully true. I had spent years helping people who rarely appreciated it. Years earning love that should have been freely given. The letter continued. Do not confuse kindness with surrender. Do not confuse loyalty with obedience. And do not allow guilt to make decisions that wisdom should make. By the time I reached the final paragraph, my eyes were burning. Not from sadness, from understanding. The last sentence stopped me cold. When the time comes, call Richard. He'll know what to do. Richard. I knew exactly who that was. Richard Holloway. Grandpa's attorney. The man who had handled nearly every legal matter in our family for over 40 years. The man Dad rarely spoke about anymore. The man I hadn't seen since Grandpa's funeral. I glanced at the clock. 12:07 a.m. Far too late for a call. At least for most people. But Richard had always been different. I searched through old contacts. To my surprise, his number was still there. My thumb hovered over the screen. For a moment I hesitated. Making that call felt like crossing a line. Like stepping into a future I couldn't yet see. Then my phone vibrated again. Dad. Calling for the 8th time. A text arrived seconds later. Emily. Please call me. Another appeared. We need to talk. Then another. It's important. I stared at those messages. The same man who had disowned me less than 24 hours earlier suddenly wanted a conversation. Interesting. Very interesting. I set the phone down. Then dialed Richard Holloway. The call connected on the second ring. A tired voice answered. Hello, Mr. Holloway. A pause. Then recognition. Emily. Yes, sir. Another pause followed. Longer this time. Almost as if he had been expecting this moment. Finally, he exhaled slowly. and said words that sent a chill through my entire body. I've been waiting years for this phone call. For a few seconds after Richard spoke, neither of us said anything. Rain continued tapping against my windows. The digital clock beside the couch glowed 12:09 a.m. And somewhere deep inside me, a feeling I hadn't experienced in years began to stir. Not anger. Not revenge. Certainty. The kind that arrives when scattered pieces finally start fitting together. Richard cleared his throat. Do you have the envelope? Yes. All of it. I think so. No, he said quietly. You don't think so, you need to know so. I looked down at the document spread across my coffee table. Then yes. Good. The relief in his voice was unmistakable, as though he had spent years worried those papers might disappear, or be destroyed, or never be found at all. Your grandfather trusted you, he continued. More than Dad. A soft sigh came through the phone. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Richard was silent, which told me everything. He asked me to scan several pages and send them immediately. By 2 a.m, we were still reviewing documents. By 3, he had confirmed what I already suspected. The trust was real. The conditions were real. The violations were potentially very real. And my father had absolutely no idea. When I finally climbed into bed, the sun was only a few hours away. My phone contained 38 missed calls. I slept anyway. Better than I had in years. The next morning began with another message from Dad. Emily. Call me. No apology. No explanation. No acknowledgement of what he'd written. Just a demand disguised as a request. I didn't answer. Instead, I made coffee and drove to Richard's office. His building sat on a quiet street 2 towns away. The same red brick structure it had been for decades. When I walked inside, Richard looked older than I remembered. His hair had turned almost completely white. His shoulders seemed thinner. But his eyes were still sharp. Very sharp. He greeted me with a handshake, then immediately got to work. For 6 hours we reviewed records, financial statements, property transfers, trust reports, tax documents, correspondence. The deeper we dug, the worse things looked. Not because my father had stolen money. He hadn't. At least not in the criminal sense. The problem was something else. Something more complicated. For years he had treated trust assets like a personal safety net for Ryan. Whenever Ryan failed, trust resources appeared. Whenever Ryan struggled, trust resources appeared. Whenever Ryan made another terrible decision, trust resources appeared again. The pattern stretched back nearly 15 years, one rescue after another, one exception after another, one justification after another. By late afternoon, Richard removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. I've spent 42 years practicing law. That long. Unfortunately. I smiled. He didn't. Emily, I've seen a lot of families destroy themselves. The room grew quiet. But this? He tapped a thick stack of papers. This wasn't about money. I knew exactly what he meant. Because he was right. The money was simply the symptom. The real disease was favoritism. Years of it. Decades of it. And everyone around my father had been forced to adapt. Mom learned not to argue. Ryan learned not to take responsibility. And I learned to expect disappointment. The following week brought more discoveries. Some painful. Some almost absurd. Meanwhile, my father continued calling. Every day. Sometimes multiple times. I never answered. Not because I wanted revenge. Because for once I wanted the truth before the conversation. And every day his messages became more desperate. Please call me. We need to clear this up. This has gone too far. Emily, answer your phone. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years I had been the one chasing him. Now the roles were reversed. One afternoon Richard called. I need you to see something. An hour later I was sitting across from him again. He slid a folder toward me. Inside was a copy of a proposed sales agreement. I frowned. What is this? The family land. My stomach tightened. Several hundred acres. The property Grandpa had spent most of his life building. The property every family gathering revolved around. The property Dad swore would stay in the family forever. They were selling it. Or trying to. I continued reading. A development company. Luxury housing project. Multi-million-dollar transaction. Projected closing date. 3 weeks away. I looked up. Does Ryan know? Richard laughed. Not because it was funny. Because the answer was obvious. Ryan helped arrange it. Of course he did. I leaned back. The disappointment hit harder than anger. Because despite everything, I had still hoped there were limits. Apparently there weren't. The next few days felt surreal. Word spread quickly through town. People began congratulating Dad. Congratulating Ryan. Talking about the deal. Talking about the future. Talking about the money. Then came the barbecue. The celebration. The party that would eventually become one of the most humiliating moments of my father's life. I wasn't invited. That detail surprised exactly nobody, but several people who attended later told me what happened. Dad stood in the backyard holding a drink. Ryan beside him. Friends and relatives everywhere. And for the first time in years, they looked victorious. Like men who had finally won. One guest eventually asked about me. According to 3 different witnesses, Dad laughed. Actually laughed. Then said, "She chose the army over family." Someone asked if I would challenge the sale. Dad shook his head. Number. The confidence in that single word was astonishing. He doesn't know, Richard said when I later told him. Number. He really doesn't. And that was the problem. My father wasn't being malicious anymore. He was being careless. Careless people eventually make mistakes, big ones. A week before the scheduled closing, Richard finished the final review. The conclusion was devastating. The trust violations were undeniable, documented, extensive, legally actionable. For several minutes, I simply stared out his office window. Cars passed below. People walked sidewalks. Life continued normally. Yet I knew mine was about to change. "Do you want to proceed?" Richard asked. I didn't answer immediately, because despite everything, this was still my father. The man who taught me how to ride a bike. The man who attended my high school graduation. The man who once carried me into the house after I fell asleep in the truck. People are rarely all good or all bad. That's what makes family so complicated. Finally, I looked at Richard. "What happens if I do nothing?" He didn't hesitate. "The sale moves forward. And after that, the trust may be damaged beyond repair." I nodded slowly. The answer wasn't difficult anymore. It was simply painful. 3 days later, official notices were prepared. Legal reviews were completed. Emergency motions were ready. Every document sat neatly inside a black leather folder. Waiting. The closing date arrived on a bright Thursday morning. The kind of morning that feels too peaceful for disaster. I woke before sunrise, put on my army dress uniform, pressed every crease, polished every button. Not because I wanted attention, because Grandpa would have expected professionalism. By 8:30, I was standing outside my house, the black folder under my arm, my phone buzzing again. Dad. Calling. I silenced it, then climbed into my car. An hour later, I pulled into the parking lot outside the law offices where the sale would be finalized. Luxury SUVs filled the lot. Investors had arrived. Bank representatives had arrived. Developers had arrived. And inside that building, my father was probably smiling, certain he had already won. I stepped out of the car, adjusted my uniform jacket, picked up the folder, and walked toward the entrance. Because in just a few minutes, everyone inside was about to learn something my grandfather had known for 15 years. The wrong person had been in control all along. The receptionist looked up as I entered the building. For half a second, I saw confusion cross her face, then recognition, then surprise. Not because of who I was, because of what I was wearing. Army dress blues have a way of changing a room before a single word is spoken. People notice. They straighten up. They look twice. Not out of fear, out of curiosity. I thanked her politely and followed the directions to the conference room. As I approached the closed door, I could already hear voices inside. Laughter. Confident laughter. The kind people make when they think everything has already been decided. I paused for 1 second. Not because I was nervous. Because I was remembering my grandfather. His porch. His voice. The envelope. The warning. Then I opened the door. The room immediately fell silent. Every head turned. My father's smile disappeared first. Ryan's disappeared second. Several investors looked confused. A banker adjusted his glasses. One of the attorneys frowned slightly. Nobody had expected me. Especially not my father. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Then Dad pushed his chair back. Hard. "What are you doing here?" His voice carried across the room. I calmly closed the door behind me. "Good morning, Dad. I asked you a question." I heard it. His face reddened. "I told you not to come." The words hung in the air. A few people exchanged uncomfortable glances. I looked directly at him, then smiled. Not mockingly, not cruelly, just calmly. "I'm not here as your daughter." The silence that followed felt almost physical. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Ryan stared at me. Dad blinked. "What does that even mean?" Before I could answer, another voice came from behind me. "Perhaps I can explain." Richard entered the room, carrying 3 large binders. The moment my father saw him, something changed. Only slightly. But I noticed the confidence wasn't completely gone. Yet, however, a crack had appeared. A very small crack. Richard walked to the table, placed the binders down, and sat. "Richard," Dad said, "what is this?" An issue that should have been addressed years ago. The room grew even quieter. One investor looked at another. The banker stopped reviewing documents. People could sense something was wrong. They just didn't know how wrong. Dad laughed nervously. "This isn't the time." "Actually," Richard replied, "it's exactly the time." The attorney representing the development company spoke up. "Is there a problem with the transaction?" Richard nodded. "Yes." That single word changed the atmosphere immediately. Every person in the room became alert. Pens stopped moving. Papers stopped turning. The room shifted from celebration to caution. Dad crossed his arms. "Richard, enough." "Number." The answer came instantly, firmly. The kind of firmness that only comes from someone who knows they're standing on solid ground. Then Richard opened the first binder. "My responsibility today is not to protect anyone's feelings." He looked directly at my father. "My responsibility is to protect the trust." The trust. Several people frowned. The developers looked confused. One banker immediately started taking notes. Dad's expression hardened. "There's no issue with the trust." Richard opened a document. "There is." Then another. "And there has been for years." Ryan finally jumped in. "This is ridiculous." Richard didn't even look at him. Instead, he continued turning pages, one document after another, one financial record after another, one transfer after another. The evidence piled up slowly, methodically, relentlessly. No dramatic speeches, no shouting. Just facts, which are often far more dangerous. Within 15 minutes, the atmosphere in the room had completely transformed. The investors no longer looked excited. They looked concerned. The banker no longer looked relaxed. He looked worried. And my father looked increasingly uncomfortable. Then Richard revealed the trust agreement. The original version, signed decades earlier. The room became completely silent. He explained how ownership had been structured, how authority had been delegated, how fiduciary responsibilities worked, how trust assets were supposed to be protected. The developer's attorney interrupted. "Are you saying Mr. Carter does not own these properties outright?" Richard nodded. "Correct?" The man froze. "So who does?" Richard slowly turned toward me. Every eye in the room followed. The silence felt endless. Then Richard spoke. "The trust beneficiaries." Another pause. "And under specific conditions, oversight authority transfers to Lieutenant Colonel Emily Carter." Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. Dad looked stunned. Ryan looked confused. The investors looked alarmed. The banker looked like he suddenly wished he were somewhere else. What Ryan finally said. Richard calmly handed over copies. Nobody argued anymore, because now there was documentation, signatures, legal records, evidence. The conversation changed immediately. Questions started flying. Dates, transactions, conditions, reviews, responsibilities. The developers looked increasingly uneasy. One banker stepped outside to make a phone call. Another attorney began reading faster. Very fast. The celebration was over. Dad stared at me. "How long?" His voice sounded different now. Smaller. "How long have you known?" I held his gaze. "Long enough." His jaw tightened. "Long enough for what?" "Long enough to give you every chance to do the right thing." Those words hit him harder than anything else said that morning. I could see it. Because he knew they were true. For years I had given him chances. Hundreds of them. Probably thousands. I had tolerated insults, dismissals, favoritism, disrespect. Not because I was weak. Because I kept hoping. Hoping one day he would choose fairness. One day he would choose family over pride. One day he would see me. Instead he sent a text message. And accidentally started the collapse of everything he thought he controlled. Ryan slammed both hands on the table. "This is your fault." The accusation echoed through the room. Several people looked embarrassed for him. I simply watched. "Mine. You planned this." "Number." "Yes, you did." "No, Ryan." For the first time all morning my voice became slightly harder. "I didn't create this situation." I looked directly at him. "You did." His face reddened instantly. Because deep down he knew. Every bailout, every rescue, every excuse, every special treatment. All of it had led here. Nobody else. Him. The final blow came 30 minutes later. The bank formally suspended participation. The development company postponed closing indefinitely. The transaction could not legally proceed until the trust dispute was resolved. Millions of dollars froze instantly. The room felt colder, heavier. Final. The sale was dead. At least for now. Nobody celebrated. Not even me. Because despite everything, victory didn't feel the way people imagine. It wasn't exciting. It wasn't satisfying. It was sad. Watching your father lose isn't enjoyable, even when he's the one who caused it. Especially then. By noon, the meeting was effectively over. People began leaving. Quietly. Awkwardly. Nobody wanted to be there anymore. One by one, they disappeared. Until only a handful remained. Ryan left first. Angry. Humiliated. Blaming everyone except himself. The same pattern he had followed his entire life. Then Mom left. Tears in her eyes. Unable to look at anyone. Finally, only Dad remained. Standing beside the conference table. Looking older than he had that morning. Much older. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he asked the question. Not as a businessman. Not as a father. Just as a man. Was I really that unfair? The room suddenly felt very quiet. I thought about lying. Making it easier. Softer. Kinder. Instead, I told him the truth. Yes. The single word landed like a stone. Dad looked down. For the first time in my life, he had no argument. No defense. No explanation. Just silence. A few moments later, he picked up his coat, turned toward the door, and walked away. Not angry. Not shouting. Not blaming. Simply defeated. The man who had controlled every family conversation for decades left without saying another word. And as the door closed behind him, I realized something important. The real consequences hadn't started yet, because sooner or later he was going to go home and finally sit alone with the truth. I thought the hardest part was over. I was wrong. The meeting had ended. The sale had collapsed. The truth was finally out. But families don't unravel in conference rooms. They unravel afterward. In kitchens. In living rooms. In late-night phone calls. In quiet moments when people are left alone with consequences. That evening I drove home with the radio off. The black folder sat on the passenger seat beside me. Sunlight stretched across the highway. Traffic moved steadily. Everything looked normal. Yet nothing felt normal. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying the weight of proving myself to my father. The burden was gone. And strangely enough, that felt heavier before it felt lighter. I arrived home around 6, fed my dog, changed clothes, made coffee I didn't need, then sat on the back porch. The same place where this whole chapter had truly begun. The air was warm. The sky glowed orange and purple. Crickets chirped in the distance. Peaceful, until my phone buzzed. Dad? I stared at the screen. Didn't answer. A minute later it buzzed again. Dad. Again. Then again. Then Ryan. Then Mom. Then Dad. Then Ryan. By 9 o'clock the calls were coming every few minutes. By 10 they became almost constant. Voicemails started arriving. One after another. I listened to Ryan's first. Emily, call me. The second sounded less confident. Look, this got blown out of proportion. The third was angry. The fourth was desperate. The fifth was almost pathetic. For years, Ryan had always assumed somebody would rescue him. Dad. Mom. Sometimes even me. Now there was nobody left. The system that protected him had collapsed, and he had no idea what to do. Around 10:30, I listened to a voicemail from Mom. Her voice cracked almost immediately. Please call me sweetheart. I closed my eyes. Mom had spent most of her life trying to keep peace between people who refused to change. That role ages a person. I knew she was hurting, but I also knew something else. Keeping peace and fixing problems are not the same thing. For decades, she had confused the two. The phone buzzed again. Dad. Again. I ignored it. At 11:15, another message appeared. Then another. Then another. The man who once took days to return calls was suddenly sending messages every 15 minutes. The irony wasn't lost on me. Finally, just before midnight, a text arrived. Not a demand. Not an accusation. Not an order. Just 4 words. Can we talk? I stared at the screen. For a long time. Then another message appeared. Please. That word hit differently. Because I honestly couldn't remember the last time my father had used it with me. Not as a formality. Not as a habit. But sincerely. I didn't answer that night. Or the next morning. Or the next day. Sometimes people need time to understand what happened. And my father had spent nearly 40 years believing he was right. That kind of belief doesn't disappear overnight. 3 days later, I finally called him. The silence after he answered lasted several seconds. Then he spoke. Emily. His voice sounded tired. Older. Smaller. Hi, Dad. Another pause. I didn't think you'd call. I looked out my kitchen window. Neither did I. Where are you? I asked. Home. His voice cracked slightly. The house feels awfully quiet. I knew exactly what he meant. For years, noise had protected him. Activity, control, distractions. Now all he had was reflection. We agreed to meet the following afternoon. Not at his house. Not at mine. A small diner halfway between our towns. Neutral ground. The kind of place where nobody holds home field advantage. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting alone in a booth, coffee untouched, looking out the window. For a moment, I barely recognized him. Not physically, emotionally. The certainty was gone. The authority was gone. The armor was gone. He looked like a man carrying something heavy. I sat across from him. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, he looked up. "I owe you an apology." I waited. Because apologies are easy. Accountability is harder. He nodded slowly, as though understanding exactly what I was thinking. Then he surprised me. He didn't defend himself, not once. Instead, he told the truth, the whole truth. About Ryan, about guilt, about fear, about mistakes. After Grandpa died, he had convinced himself Ryan needed protection. Then more protection. Then even more. Eventually, helping Ryan became his identity. And somewhere along the way, he stopped noticing the damage. Or maybe he noticed and chose not to see it. Sometimes those are the same thing. The hardest moment came when he looked directly at me and said, "You never needed me." I shook my head. "That's not true." "It is." "No, Dad." My voice softened. "I needed you." The pain on his face was immediate, visible, real. Then why didn't I see it? For several seconds I couldn't answer. Because the truth was complicated. Because people rarely become who they are overnight. Finally I said, "Because you were too busy worrying about the child who kept falling to notice the one who learned how to stand." His eyes filled with tears, actual tears. I had seen my father cry exactly twice in my life. At Grandpa's funeral. And now, the diner became very quiet. Neither of us rushed to fill the silence. Some moments deserve space. This was one of them. Eventually, he looked down at his hands. "I thought you'd come back no matter what." There it was. The truth beneath all the other truths. Not favoritism. Not money. Not even Ryan. Entitlement. He believed my love was guaranteed. Unconditional. Permanent. No matter how poorly he treated it. And for years he had been right. Until he wasn't. I reached across the table. Not because everything was fixed. Because some bridges deserve an opportunity to be rebuilt. Even slowly. Even carefully. "I'm not angry anymore," he nodded. "But things can't go back to the way they were." Another nod. This one heavier. "I know." And for the first time I believed him. Over the next year our relationship changed. Not magically. Not perfectly. Slowly. The way real healing happens. Ryan eventually got a job. Kept it. For once. Mom stopped trying to manage everyone else's emotions. Dad started listening more than talking. And I finally stopped carrying responsibilities that never belonged to me. The trust remained protected. The land remained in the family. And together with Richard I established something Grandpa would have loved. A scholarship fund for military families. Every year it helps young men and women pursue education and service. Every year Grandpa's name lives on. Exactly the way he deserved. About 13 months after the meeting, I received a text message on my birthday. Simple. No speeches. No drama. No conditions. Just one sentence. "I'm proud of you, kid." I stared at the screen for a long time, then smiled. Not because the words fixed the past. They didn't. Nothing can. But because they arrived honestly. Finally, after all those years, I put the phone down, looked out toward the evening sky, and continued living the life I had built myself. Not because my father finally approved, but because I had learned something much more important. Your worth does not begin when someone recognizes it. Your worth was there all along, and sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving people wrong. It's finally stopping the need to prove anything at all. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to walk away from someone you loved in order to protect your peace? Let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. We share new stories every day. And if you enjoy heartfelt family dramas like this one, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. Until next time, take care of yourselves and the people who truly value you. They thought I was alone. No lawyer, no support, no voice. I could feel it the moment I stepped into that courtroom, the subtle shift in the air, the way conversations softened just enough to make room for quiet judgment. A few heads turned, then lingered a second too long. Not curious, not concerned, just certain. certain they already knew who I was. Or more precisely what I wasn't. My father didn't even try to hide his smile. "Can't afford a lawyer," he said loud enough for the row behind him to hear. "That's really something." A few people chuckled, soft, polite, controlled, the kind of laughter that doesn't draw attention to itself but still lands exactly where it's meant to. I didn't respond. Because I knew something they didn't. And in less than an hour, everyone in that room would too. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and stale paper, the kind of place where decisions linger longer than voices. I stood near the defense table, hands loosely clasped in front of me, posture straight without effort. Across the aisle, my family occupied their side like they owned the room. My father sat at the center navy suit tailored to perfection, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested confidence not earned today, but practiced over years of getting what he wanted. My mother sat beside him, pearls resting neatly at her collarbone, her lips pressed into a thin line that could have passed for composure if you didn't know her well. I did. That line meant she was pleased. To their right, my brother leaned back in his chair, one ankle resting on the opposite knee, his gaze flicking toward me briefly before drifting away again as if I were no more than a passing inconvenience. Their attorney stood nearby, flipping through a thick binder, occasionally exchanging quiet remarks with my father. Prepared, organized, comfortable. Everything I wasn't supposed to be. I could still hear my father's voice echoing in my head. Can't afford a lawyer. He hadn't asked, he had assumed. And the room had agreed. I shifted my weight slightly, letting my eyes move across the courtroom without urgency. The judge's bench remained empty for now, but the clerk was already in place, organizing documents with practiced efficiency. A couple sat quietly behind me, whispering to each other. Somewhere near the back, a pen clicked in a steady, nervous rhythm. Normal sounds, ordinary. But beneath it all there was tension, thin, almost invisible, like a wire stretched too tight. "Still time to reconsider," my father said, his voice lower now, though no less sharp. "You don't have to embarrass yourself like this." I turned my head just enough to meet his eyes. There it was again, that certainty. The quiet belief that he understood the outcome before the first word had even been spoken. "I'm not embarrassed," I said calmly. My mother let out a small, dismissive breath. "Of course you aren't," she murmured almost to herself. My brother smirked. Their attorney glanced at me briefly, then leaned toward my father. "We'll keep this straightforward," he said. "Given her situation, I don't anticipate complications." I caught the hesitation before the word situation, the subtle adjustment, the polite substitution. It almost made me smile. Almost. I looked down at the file in my hands. It wasn't thick, not like theirs. No color-coded tabs, no stacks of exhibits. Just a clean folder neatly organized, every page exactly where it needed to be. They thought that meant I was unprepared. They thought wrong. The bailiff stepped forward, his voice cutting cleanly through the room. "All rise." Chairs shifted. Conversations died instantly. The judge entered with measured steps, his expression unreadable eyes scanning the room with quiet authority. We all stood until he took his seat, then sat again at his signal. "Case number 47-218, the clerk announced. Petition regarding estate distribution and contested ownership." Estate. Ownership. Words that sounded clinical on paper, clean, simple. They never were. The judge adjusted his glasses, glancing briefly at the documents in front of him before looking up. His gaze moved from my family's side of the room to mine, lingering just a fraction longer than expected. "Counsel," he said, nodding toward my family's attorney. The man stood immediately, confidence radiating from him as he stepped forward. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward matter. My clients seek to resolve a dispute concerning property that was quite clearly never intended to be held by the defendant." He gestured toward me without looking. "The defendant," he continued, "has no legal representation, which unfortunately limits the efficiency of these proceedings, but we will do our best to keep things clear and concise." A few faint nods from the gallery. Agreement. "Of course." "Very well," the judge said, his tone neutral. "We'll proceed." The attorney began outlining their case dates, signatures, transfers of ownership. His voice was smooth, practiced, each sentence landing exactly where it was meant to. On paper, it sounded convincing, structured, logical. If you didn't know what to listen for. I stood still, listening carefully, not interrupting, not reacting. My fingers rested lightly against the edge of my folder, feeling the texture of the paper beneath them. Every claim he made I followed. Every omission I noted. Every assumption I stored away. Because assumptions were where people made mistakes. And mistakes were where cases turned. At one point, the attorney paused, glancing briefly in my direction before continuing. Given the absence of any substantive counter-argument from the defendant, we believe the court will find in favor of my clients without difficulty. There it was again. Absence. Silence mistaken for weakness. The judge's gaze shifted toward me. You'll have an opportunity to respond, he said evenly. I nodded once. Yes, Your Honor. My father leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly as if the outcome had already been decided. My mother adjusted her bracelet, her movements precise, controlled. My brother didn't even bother looking at me this time. They were already moving on. Already done. I let my eyes drift briefly to the judge, then back to the documents in my hands. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier, not suffocating, just focused. Like everything was narrowing toward a single point. Toward me. Good. I closed the folder gently, the soft sound of paper, meeting paper, barely audible, but it was enough. Because for the first time since I had walked into that room, my father's gaze shifted again. Not confident. Not dismissive. Just curious. It was subtle. But it was there. And that was all I needed. I lifted my head, meeting the judge's eyes as the attorney finished his opening. No further statements at this time, Your Honor. A brief pause. Then the judge turned to me. Whenever you're ready. I took a breath, not deep, not dramatic, just enough. Then I stepped forward. Thank you, Your Honor, I said. And for the first time that morning, the room went completely still. I didn't start with an argument. I didn't raise my voice, didn't rush to contradict anything their attorney had just said. Instead, I let a small silence settle first, not long enough to seem uncertain, just long enough to shift the rhythm of the room. It was a technique I'd learned years ago, though not here. Silence used correctly forces people to listen. My name is Emily Carter, I said, steady and clear, and I'll be representing myself today. No reaction from my family? They had already dismissed that fact. The judge nodded once. Go ahead, Ms. Carter. I glanced briefly at the documents in my hand, then back up. Before addressing the claims presented, I'd like to clarify a few points regarding the nature of this dispute. Their attorney adjusted his stance slightly, preparing to interrupt. I could see it in the way his shoulders shifted, the way his fingers tightened around his pen. He expected confusion, hesitation. He didn't get either. This is not simply a disagreement over property, I continued. It's a question of intent control and the timeline of ownership decisions made prior to my departure from my family's residence. My father let out a quiet, impatient breath. Departure. That was a generous way of putting it. I could feel the past pressing at the edges of my mind, not as a flood, but as fragments, controlled, contained. Because I didn't need to relive it. I just needed to use it. I was 19 the day I left. No dramatic fight, no shouting, just a conversation that ended in a kind of silence I hadn't understood at the time. The kind that doesn't ask you to stay. You're making a mistake, my father had said, not looking up from the newspaper in his hands. I'm making a choice, I had replied. He turned the page. That was the end of it. My mother didn't argue. She didn't plead. She simply watched me pack her expression unreadable, as if she were observing something inevitable rather than preventable. My brother had laughed. Military, he said, leaning against the doorway. That's where people go when they don't have options. I didn't answer him. Because at the time, I wasn't entirely sure he was wrong. Back in the courtroom, I shifted my weight slightly, grounding myself in the present. My family's claim, I said, is based on the assumption that I relinquished my interest in the property when I left. Their attorney nodded immediately. That is correct, Your Honor. The defendant's departure was voluntary, and no further claim was made for several years. I let him finish. Then I tilted my head slightly. Voluntary, I repeated. That's an interesting choice of words. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. The judge leaned forward just a fraction. Clarify! I nodded. At the time of my departure, I was given two options: remain under conditions that restricted my autonomy, or leave without financial support, without access to family-held assets, and without any expectation of return. My mother shifted in her seat. Subtle, but noticeable. That is not coercion in the legal sense, the attorney interjected quickly. It was a familial disagreement. Perhaps, I said calmly, but it is relevant to the context of intent. He opened his mouth again, then closed it. Because he didn't have a clean way to counter that. Not yet. I could feel the room adjusting. It wasn't obvious. No one spoke. No one moved in any significant way. But the energy had changed just enough to register. The quiet certainty that had filled the space earlier was no longer as solid. Doubt had a way of doing that. I continued, my voice even. Following my departure, I received no communication from my family regarding the property in question for a period of 7 years. The judge's pen paused. 7 years was not a small detail. During that time, I added, I was not asked to sign any documents relinquishing ownership. I was not informed of any transfer. I was not contacted regarding any legal changes. That's because my father said, suddenly unable to hold back any longer, you made it clear you didn't want anything to do with us. His voice carried across the courtroom sharper than he intended. The judge's eyes flicked toward him briefly. Sir, you'll have your opportunity. My father leaned back again, jaw tightening. I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. 7 years. They had said it like it proved something, like time erased responsibility, like silence meant consent. But time didn't erase intent. It revealed it. I returned, I said, bringing the focus back where it belonged only after being notified of a pending sale involving the property. Their attorney straightened. Which again, Your Honor, occurred well after any reasonable expectation of claim. After I was excluded from all communication regarding that property, I said not raising my voice but not yielding the floor either. He stopped. Not because I overpowered him. Because I didn't need to. The judge glanced between us, then made a small note on the document in front of him. That was the second shift. Small, quiet, but real. I could feel my brother's eyes on me now. For the first time since I had walked into the room. Curious, uncertain. He didn't recognize this version of me. That was fine. He wasn't supposed to. I adjusted the folder in my hands, opening it just enough to slide a single document free. I didn't present it yet, not immediately. Timing mattered. Everything here was about timing. I understand the assumption being made, I said. That I left and therefore gave up any claim. That I remained silent and therefore consented to whatever decisions were made in my absence. I let that settle. Then added, but assumptions are not evidence. The words landed cleanly. No emphasis needed. No dramatics. Just fact. Their attorney inhaled slowly, recalibrating. I could see him working through it, adjusting his strategy, searching for a way to regain control of the narrative. He would try to push harder now, narrow the argument, reduce it to something simpler. Predictable. Your Honor, he said, stepping forward again. Even if we entertain the defendant's interpretation, the lack of action over such an extended period does not constitute legal abandonment without formal documentation, I finished. He stopped mid-sentence, just for a second. But it was enough. Because now the interruption wasn't emotional. It was precise. The judge looked up. Really looked this time. Not at my documents. At me. And in that brief moment I saw it. Not recognition. Not yet. But interest. Focused. Measured. I lowered my gaze slightly as if unaware of the shift, though every part of me registered it. Because this was where things began to change. Not in one dramatic moment, but in small fractures. Hairline cracks in certainty. My intention, I said, is not to complicate these proceedings. A faint, almost ironic pause, only to ensure that they are accurate. The judge leaned back slightly in his chair, fingers resting together. Proceed, he said. And for the first time since the hearing began, it didn't feel like I was the one on the defensive anymore. The shift didn't announce itself. No one in that courtroom sat up suddenly or gasped or exchanged dramatic looks. It was quieter than that, more precise, like a weight being redistributed across the room, subtle but unmistakable once you felt it. Their attorney felt it. I saw it in the way he adjusted his stance, no longer leaning comfortably into his argument, but standing straighter now, more deliberate. His confidence hadn't disappeared, but it had narrowed, focused. Good. That meant he was thinking. That meant he was no longer certain. "Your Honor," he said. Recovering quickly, even if the defendant wishes to argue technical retention of ownership, the practical reality remains unchanged. She has had no involvement with the property for years. No maintenance, no contribution, no communication. He let that list hang as if each word added weight. Functionally, he concluded her claim is disconnected. Disconnected. Another carefully chosen word. I let it sit for a moment, then nodded slightly. I agree. The response caught him off guard. It was small, just a flicker in his eyes, but it was there. "You agree," he repeated. "Yes," I said calmly. "I have been disconnected. From the property, from the decisions made regarding it, from the communication surrounding it." I took a step forward, just enough to close the distance between where I stood and the center of the room, not aggressive, not confrontational. Just present. But that disconnection, I continued, was not mutual. A pause. That distinction matters. The judge's pen moved again. Their attorney opened his mouth, then stopped. He wasn't sure yet where I was going. He should have been. I slid the document I had been holding onto the table in front of me, aligning it carefully before looking back up. "I'd like to address the timeline more precisely," I said. "Proceed," the judge replied. I turned, slightly angling my body just enough to acknowledge both the bench and the opposing side. 7 years, I said. That's the period my family has referenced repeatedly. 7 years of absence, of silence, of presumed disinterest. I let my gaze settle briefly on my father. He held it this time. No smirk, no easy confidence. Just calculation. "I'd like to focus on year 3, I continued. A faint crease formed between the attorney's brows. Year 3 wasn't in his outline. Year 3. I remembered it clearly. Not because it had been easy, but because it hadn't. That was the year everything either held or broke. I was stationed overseas at the time, I said. My voice steady, measured. My access to communication was limited but not non-existent. I received correspondence, official notices, documentation. I tapped the folder lightly. But I did not receive any notice regarding changes to the property in question. That's because no formal change occurred at that time, the attorney interjected quickly. I nodded, correct. He blinked. Again, agreement where he expected resistance. It unsettled him. However, I continued, that was the year preliminary discussions began. The room went still. Not loudly, but enough. Their attorney's expression tightened. Objection, Your Honor. Speculation. I have documentation, I said, without raising my voice, without rushing the words. The objection died before it fully formed. The judge looked at me. You'll have an opportunity to present it. I inclined my head slightly, of course. I could feel it now. The room wasn't just listening. It was waiting. My point, I said, is not that decisions were finalized during that period. My point is that decisions were initiated, without my knowledge. I let that settle, then added, and that pattern continued. Their attorney stepped forward again, more forcefully this time. Your Honor. Even if preliminary conversations occurred, they do not constitute legal action. My clients were under no obligation to consult the defendant regarding hypothetical discussions. Agreed, I said. He stopped. Again. Because I wasn't fighting him on the surface level. I was letting him build his argument, while removing the foundation underneath it. But hypothetical discussions, I continued, often lead to concrete actions. I reached into the folder, pulling out a second document, this time placing it beside the first. And when those actions occur without proper notification, that becomes relevant. The judge's gaze shifted to the documents. He didn't ask for them yet, but he would. Across the room, my mother's posture had changed. It was subtle, just a slight tension in her shoulders, a stillness in her hands that hadn't been there before. My brother no longer leaned back in his chair. Both feet were now planted on the ground, his attention fixed. And my father? He was watching me. Not dismissing. Not mocking. Watching. As if trying to reconcile the person in front of him with the one he thought he knew. You've structured your argument around absence, I said, returning my focus to the attorney. Around the idea that lack of involvement equals lack of claim. That is a reasonable interpretation, he began. It's a convenient interpretation, I corrected gently. The distinction landed. I took another small step forward. Because it assumes that involvement was an option. Silence. This time heavier. I could feel the tension now, not just in the room but in the space between each word, the careful balance of pressure and restraint. Push too hard and it becomes emotional, too soft and it disappears. This wasn't about proving them wrong all at once. It was about making it impossible for them to stay comfortable. Your Honor, the attorney said, his tone tightening slightly. We are moving away from the central issue. The ownership structure is directly tied to the decision-making process that preceded it, I said. Not interrupting. Completing. He exhaled slowly, recalibrating again. This time it took longer. The judge leaned forward slightly, his attention no longer divided. Ms. Carter, he said, you're suggesting that the defendant, your family, initiated actions that ultimately affected ownership without proper notification. Yes, Your Honor. And you intend to demonstrate that? I do. A beat. Then proceed carefully, he said. Not a warning. A recognition. Carefully. I almost smiled. I reached for the first document, sliding it forward just enough for the clerk to retrieve when instructed. Not yet. Not until it mattered most. Before I present these, I said there's one more point I'd like to clarify. The attorney stiffened slightly. He didn't like surprises. My family has framed this as a simple matter, I continued, a straightforward dispute with an obvious resolution. I let my gaze move across the room, over the gallery, over the rows of silent observers who had come in expecting something routine. But simple cases, I added quietly, don't usually require this much effort to control the narrative. The words settled into the space between us. Not loud. Not sharp. Just undeniable. For a moment no one spoke. Not the attorney. Not my father. Not even the quiet whispers from the back of the room. Then the judge broke the silence. Ms. Carter, he said, his voice measured, you seem unusually familiar with procedural nuance for someone without legal representation. There it was. Not the full question, but close. Very close. I met his gaze. Held it. And for the first time since I had entered that courtroom, I didn't look like someone standing alone. I've had some training, I said. Nothing more. Nothing less. Across the room, their attorney's expression changed. Just slightly. But enough. Because now, he was starting to wonder. And once doubt enters a room like this, it doesn't leave quietly. The word training didn't linger long in the air, but the effect did. It was like a thin fracture running through glass. At first, almost invisible. Then slowly, it spread. Their attorney adjusted his cufflinks. Not because they needed adjusting, but because his hands needed something to do. My father shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping once against the armrest before going still again. My brother leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, now watching me with a kind of focus I had never seen from him before. No one said it. But the question had already formed. What kind of training? I didn't answer it. Not yet. Your Honor, their attorney said, stepping forward again, voice regaining some of its earlier confidence. Though the edges were tighter now, regardless of the defendant's familiarity with legal terminology, the facts remain unchanged. My clients have maintained exclusive control over the property for years. They have invested in it, managed it, and made decisions in its best interest. He turned slightly toward the judge, reinforcing his position. The defendant's sudden reappearance, he added, coincides conveniently with a pending sale. That timing is notable. Convenient? Another word meant to shape perception. I let it pass. Timing is relevant, I said, but so is sequence. He frowned. Sequence? Yes. I reached for the first document and finally slid it forward, placing it squarely on the table. This, I said, is a record of internal correspondence between my family and a third-party broker dated approximately 18 months prior to the initiation of sale proceedings. The clerk moved to retrieve it at the judge's signal. Paper shifted softly as it changed hands. Their attorney didn't move, but I saw the brief tightening in his jaw. He hadn't expected documentation. Not like this. Your Honor, he said carefully, I would caution against placing undue weight on informal communications. Preliminary discussions do not equate to legal action. Of course not, I said. Again, agreement. But this time I didn't stop there. But they do establish intent. The judge's eyes moved across the document, scanning quickly, then more slowly. His expression didn't change, but his attention sharpened. Continue, he said. I took a step closer, not toward them, but toward the center, toward the space where everything converged. The correspondence outlines a proposed restructuring of ownership, I said. Not finalized, not executed, but clearly initiated. I paused, letting the word settle. And notably, I added it references the need to avoid unnecessary complications from absent parties. The phrase landed, because it wasn't mine. It was theirs. My mother's fingers tightened around her bracelet. My father's gaze flicked just once toward their attorney. And in that single glance, something shifted. Responsibility. Pressure. That phrase, I continued, appears multiple times throughout the correspondence, always in reference to individuals who were not present, and therefore not consulted. Their attorney stepped forward quickly. Your Honor, this is being taken out of context. Then clarify the context, the judge said without looking up. A beat. The attorney hesitated. Just for a second. But in a room like this, a second is enough. He cleared his throat. The language is standard. It reflects logistical considerations, not intentional exclusion. Standard 1 repeated softly. I reached for the second document and placed it beside the first. This is a follow-up exchange, I said, 6 months later. The clerk collected it. The judge read. And this time the pause was longer. Because the wording was different. Less careful. Less neutral. Proceed, the judge said again, his tone quieter now. In this exchange I said the same concern is addressed. But the language shifts. It references the need to finalize decisions before any claims can be raised. Silence. No movement. No interruption. Their attorney didn't speak this time. Because he couldn't. Not without contradicting what was now in front of the judge. I didn't press. I didn't need to. The documents were doing the work. Across the room, my brother exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. My mother's posture had gone rigid, her composure held together by habit rather than ease. And my father, he wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking at the table. Ms. Carter, the judge said, lifting his gaze, you're suggesting that these communications indicate a deliberate effort to proceed without notifying all parties with potential claims. Yes, Your Honor. And that you were one of those parties. Yes. Another pause. Measured. Deliberate. Their attorney stepped forward again, but this time there was no smooth confidence, no practiced rhythm. Your Honor, even if we accept this interpretation, it does not negate the fact that no formal claim was made during that period. The defendant, Ms. Carter, remained silent. He turned slightly toward me, seizing on what he thought was still solid ground. Silence, he said, has consequences. I met his gaze. It does, I agreed. Then I tilted my head slightly. But only when it's a choice. The words didn't need emphasis. They carried their own weight. The judge leaned back, fingers steepled now, his attention fully fixed. Explain that, he said. I took a breath. Not to steady myself, but to choose the next words carefully. Silence implies awareness, I said. It assumes that a person knew something was happening and chose not to respond. I let that settle. Lack of notification, I continued, is different. It removes the opportunity to act entirely. A beat. And without that opportunity, there can be no meaningful silence. The room held still. Not tense. Not chaotic. Just focused. Their attorney didn't interrupt this time. He couldn't. Because the argument had shifted beyond simple ownership. It was no longer about whether I had spoken. It was about whether I had been given the chance to. And that was a much harder position to defend. The judge glanced down at the documents again, then back up at me. You've structured this argument very precisely, he said. Not a question. A statement. Yes, Your Honor. He studied me for a moment longer than before. Then his gaze moved slowly toward the opposing side. Toward their attorney. Counsel, he said, were you aware of these communications prior to today? The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. No splash. Just ripples. The attorney hesitated. Not because he didn't understand the question, but because he didn't like the answer. I was not provided with these specific documents, he said carefully. Another ripple. The judge's expression didn't change. But something behind his eyes did. A quiet recalibration. Then he asked the question that shifted everything just a little further off balance. Should you have been? Silence. Real silence this time. My father finally looked up. And for the first time since I had walked into that courtroom, he didn't look certain. He looked unsure. And once certainty cracks, it doesn't go back the way it was. The silence after the judge's question didn't break all at once. It unraveled. Slowly. Deliberately. Like something that had been held too tight for too long and finally began to loosen. Should you have been, the judge, repeated, his voice calm but sharper, now focused. Their attorney opened his mouth, then closed it again. His gaze flicked toward my father, searching not for guidance but for alignment. For something he could stand on. My father didn't move. Didn't speak. And in that stillness the answer became obvious. The attorney cleared his throat. Your Honor, I can only work with the materials provided to me if there were additional internal communications that directly relate to the ownership structure being argued in this court. The judge finished quietly. Another pause. Then yes, he added almost as an afterthought, you probably should have been. The words were not loud, but they carried weight. Not accusation. Not yet. But direction. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The room had already shifted again, subtly but undeniably. The neat structure my family had built, the carefully controlled narrative, had started to lose its shape. Edges were softening. Certainty was thinning. And in its place, questions. The judge turned back to me. Ms. Carter, he said, his tone measured. You've demonstrated a clear understanding of procedural nuance, evidentiary timing, and argument framing. He paused. You also mentioned having some training. There it was. Not implied. Not circling. Direct. I held his gaze. Not defiant. Not hesitant. Just steady. Yes, Your Honor. He leaned back slightly, studying me, not just what I had said, but how I had said it. The cadence, the restraint, the precision. It wasn't the kind of familiarity someone picked up casually. He knew that. What kind of training, he asked. The question didn't echo. It settled. Right where it needed to. Across the room I could feel it, every eye shifting, every assumption recalculating in real time. My brother leaned forward further, his posture tense now. My mother's composure had gone completely still, as if any movement might give something away. And my father, he was watching me again. But not the way he had before. Not with dismissal. Not even with curiosity. With something else. Something closer to recognition. I didn't answer immediately. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because timing still mattered. I received formal legal training through the United States military, I said. No flourish. No emphasis. Just fact. The words landed, and for a moment nothing happened. No gasps. No visible reaction. Just processing. Then the judge's expression shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. Military, he repeated. Yes, Your Honor. He nodded once slowly, as if fitting a final piece into place. That explains the structure, he said quietly. Not to me. To himself. Their attorney exhaled through his nose, a short, controlled breath. He adjusted his stance again, but this time there was no illusion of ease. The confidence he had walked in with was still there, but it had narrowed, tightened into something defensive. Because now, he knew he had misjudged the field. Your Honor. He began attempting to regain ground while the defendant's background is noteworthy. It does not alter the legal standing of the case. It alters how I evaluate her arguments, the judge said, cutting in not sharply but definitively. A line drawn. Clear. The attorney stopped. Because there was nothing to push against. The judge turned his attention fully back to me. Ms. Carter, he said, are you currently serving? Yes, Your Honor. A brief pause. Rank. Major. This time the reaction was not silent. It wasn't loud, but it moved. A shift in posture, a quiet intake of breath somewhere behind me, the subtle sound of someone adjusting in their seat. Because now, the room understood. Not completely, but enough. My brother's eyes widened slightly, the expression gone before it fully formed. My mother's hand tightened against her bracelet, the pearls pressing into her skin. And my father, he didn't look away. But something in his face changed. Something small. Something irreversible. The judge nodded again, slower this time. J.A.G. Corps, he asked. Yes, Your Honor. The confirmation settled into the room like gravity. Unavoidable. For a moment no one spoke. Not the attorney. Not my family. Not even the quiet observers in the back. Then the judge did something that shifted everything. He turned. Not to me, but to the opposing counsel. Counsel. He said, his tone calm, almost conversational. Did you know that the individual you've been characterizing as unrepresented is a commissioned officer in the United States military trained in legal practice? The attorney's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. No, Your Honor, he said finally. The judge tilted his head slightly. And then he asked, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a precision that cut through the entire room. Did you really not know who she is? The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. Because the impact was immediate. The attorney froze. Not visibly, not in a way that would draw attention to itself, but in the smallest, most telling way, he stopped moving entirely. No shifting weight. No adjusting papers. Nothing. My father went pale. Not gradually. All at once. As if something had been pulled out from under him without warning. My mother's composure cracked, not in a dramatic gesture, but in the way her lips parted slightly, her breath catching just enough to betray the control she had been holding on to. My brother looked between them, then back at me, as if trying to rewrite everything he thought he knew in real time. And I stood exactly where I had been from the beginning, unmoved, unraised, unshaken. Because this wasn't a reveal meant to humiliate. It wasn't revenge in the way they expected. Loud. Sharp. Public. This was something else. This was correction. The judge let the silence stretch just long enough for it to settle. Then he turned back to me. Proceed, Major Carter. Not Ms. Carter. Not the defendant. Major. And just like that. The room didn't look at me the same way anymore. Proceed, Major Carter. The title didn't echo, but it changed everything. It wasn't just recognition. It was calibration. The room adjusted around that single word major like a lens snapping into focus. What had once been interpreted as restraint now read as discipline. What had been dismissed as silence now carried weight. I didn't react to it. I didn't nod, didn't pause longer than necessary. I simply continued because anything else would have turned the moment into something personal. And this wasn't personal anymore. Thank you, Your Honor, I said. I reached for the documents already in front of the clerk. I'd like to enter both exhibits into the record. Admitted, the judge replied. Paper shifted. A quiet stamp. A formal action, but it carried consequence. Because now those documents weren't just statements. They were evidence. Their attorney inhaled slowly, straightening his shoulders. He wasn't done, not yet. But the way he moved had changed. There was no longer any pretense of controlling the pace. Now he was reacting. Trying to keep up. Your Honor, he said, even if we accept these communications as relevant, they do not establish that the defendant, Major Carter, was entitled to notice at that stage. The property was under the operational control of my clients, and all decisions made were within their rights as managing parties. There it was. A pivot. Not denial, he couldn't deny the documents. So he reframed. Control instead of intent. Authority instead of inclusion. It was a reasonable move. But it came too late. Operational control, I repeated quietly. I took a step forward, just enough to place myself between the two tables, not confronting, not encroaching, just present in the space where arguments became decisions. That term implies a structure, I continued. Defined roles, defined authority, defined boundaries. The judge nodded slightly. Yes, it does. I met his gaze. Then I'd like to clarify those definitions. I opened my folder again, carefully, deliberately, and removed a third document. Thinner. Simpler. But far more precise. This, I said, placing it on the table, is the original ownership agreement, the version executed prior to my departure. The clerk retrieved it, the judge read. And this time, he didn't rush. Across the room I heard it, the subtle shift of fabric as my father sat up straighter. My mother's hand moved to her lap, fingers interlacing tightly now. My brother leaned back again, but not in comfort. In distance, as if trying to separate himself from what was unfolding. The agreement, I continued, outlines shared ownership among all named parties. No clause assigns exclusive decision-making authority without unanimous consent. The judge's eyes moved across the page again. Slower. More carefully. Their attorney stepped forward, but the rhythm was gone now. Your honor agreements like this are often interpreted with practical flexibility. Flexibility, I said, does not negate requirement. He stopped. Again. Because this time there was nowhere to pivot. The agreement is clear, I continued. Decisions affecting ownership structure require acknowledgement from all parties listed. I let the word settle. Then added, I am listed. Silence. Heavier now. Not uncertain. Not curious. Just undeniable. The judge closed the document, resting his hands on it for a moment before looking up. Counsel, he said, turning to the opposing attorney, were these terms considered in your argument? The attorney hesitated. Not long. But long enough. We interpreted the management clause as granting sufficient authority for interim decisions. Interim decisions, the judge repeated, his tone even. Not structural ones. A pause. Would you agree? The attorney didn't answer immediately, because there was no clean answer left. Yes, Your Honor, he said finally. And just like that, the foundation gave way. My father leaned forward suddenly. This is being misrepresented. Sir, the judge said, not raising his voice, you will not interrupt proceedings. The words were calm, but final. My father sat back, slowly, but the composure was gone now. Not entirely, but enough. I didn't look at him. I kept my focus where it belonged. The sequence of events, I said, demonstrates a consistent pattern. Initiate discussions, proceed without notification, and finalize decisions before acknowledgement could be requested. I paused. Not for effect. For clarity. That is not oversight, I added. It is exclusion. The word settled. Firm. Unavoidable. Their attorney exhaled, rubbing briefly at his temple before lowering his hand. Your Honor. Even if the court finds procedural errors, the investments made by my clients, financial and otherwise, must be considered. They have maintained the property for years. They have increased its value. That contribution cannot simply be dismissed. It was his last angle. Value. Contribution. Equity. And it was valid. Partially. I don't dispute that, I said. He blinked. Again, agreement. But he knew better now than to trust it. The property has been maintained, I continued. Its value has increased. I inclined my head slightly. That reflects effort. A pause. But effort, I added, does not override agreement. The distinction held. Clean. Sharp. The judge nodded once. Slowly. Then he looked down at the documents again, each one now part of the record, each one reinforcing the same pattern. When he looked up, his expression hadn't changed. But the direction had. The court finds, he said, that the defendant, Major Carter, was not properly notified of actions affecting shared ownership as required by the original agreement. A breath. Not loud, but collective. Furthermore, he continued, the communications presented indicate an awareness of that requirement and a deliberate effort to proceed without fulfilling it. My mother's hand tightened. My brother looked away. My father didn't move at all. As such, the judge said, the actions taken regarding the property's restructuring are deemed procedurally invalid. Another pause. Measured. Final. The court rules in favor of the defendant. No gavel. No dramatic sound. Just words. And the weight they carried. For a moment no one spoke. Not the attorney. Not my family. Not even the quiet observers in the back. Then the room exhaled. Soft. Controlled. But real. Their attorney stepped back slowly, his posture no longer sharp, no longer precise. He gathered his papers without looking at them, his movements automatic. My brother stood then sat back down again, unsure what to do with himself. My mother stared straight ahead, her expression fixed, as if still trying to hold on to something that had already slipped away. And my father? He finally looked at me. Not with anger. Not with pride. Not even with disappointment. With something quieter. Something harder to define. Recognition. But it came too late. The courtroom didn't erupt. There was no dramatic reaction, no raised voices or sudden movement. The ruling had already done its work. It had settled into the room like something final, something that didn't need to be repeated to be understood. People began to gather their things. Chairs shifted softly against the floor. Papers were stacked, folders closed, the quiet routine of endings. I remained where I was for a moment longer. Not because I needed to. Because I chose to. Major Carter. The judge's voice carried just enough to reach me without drawing attention from the rest of the room. I turned slightly. Yes, Your Honor. He held my gaze for a brief second, long enough to convey something that didn't need to be said out loud. Clear presentation, he said, measured. A simple acknowledgement. Professional. I inclined my head. Thank you, Your Honor. He nodded once, then turned to the clerk, already moving on to the next case. That was how it worked. Even moments that changed everything for someone became routine for everyone else. I gathered my documents carefully, sliding each one back into the folder in the same order I had taken them out. No rush, no hesitation. Control. Not of the room. Of myself. Emily. My name stopped me just as I was about to turn. I hadn't heard it like that in years. Not from him. I looked over my shoulder. My father was standing now. So was my mother. My brother remained seated, his gaze fixed on the floor. For a moment, no one moved. It felt almost like the beginning of something, but I knew better. This wasn't a beginning. It was something else. You didn't have to do this here, my father said. His voice wasn't sharp anymore. It wasn't dismissive. It was quieter, controlled but not confident. I turned fully to face him. I didn't choose the setting, I replied. You did. He exhaled slowly, as if that answer had been expected, even if he hadn't wanted to hear it. That's not what I meant. No, I said, it usually isn't. My mother stepped forward slightly. We didn't know, she said, her voice tight, careful. About your position, your career. I held her gaze. You didn't ask. The words weren't harsh. They didn't need to be. She looked down briefly, her fingers tightening together before relaxing again. We thought, I know what you thought, I said. And I did. I had known for years. My brother finally looked up. You could have told us, he said. There was no accusation in his voice. Just confusion. I could have, I said. A pause. But it wouldn't have changed anything. Silence settled between us again. Not uncomfortable. Just honest? Because that was the part no one wanted to say out loud. This wasn't about misunderstanding. It wasn't about missing information. It was about perspective. And perspective doesn't change just because new facts appear. My father took a step closer. Not enough to close the distance, but enough to acknowledge it. You made your point, he said. I studied him for a moment. The man who had once looked at me like I was an inconvenience, a mistake, a decision he didn't agree with but didn't care enough to stop. Now, he was looking at me like he was trying to understand something that had always been there and had simply gone unnoticed. I didn't come here to make a point, I said. His brow furrowed slightly. I came here, I continued, because something that belonged to me was being taken without my knowledge. I let that settle. That's all. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. But it was true. My mother's voice came softer this time. You could have come to us first. I almost smiled. Not because it was funny. Because it was familiar. I did, I said. She looked up confused. When I left, I clarified. A pause. That was me choosing not to stay in something that didn't see me. No one spoke. Because there was nothing to argue with. The hallway outside the courtroom was visible through the open door, bright open, moving. People passed by, unaware of what had just ended inside. I glanced toward it, then back at them. "You weren't wrong," I said finally. My father's eyes narrowed slightly. "About what?" I met his gaze. "About me being on my own." A breath. "You were right." My brother shifted slightly as if he wanted to say something but didn't. My mother's expression softened just a fraction. My father didn't move at all. "But you were wrong about something else," I added. A small pause. "You thought that meant I was weak." The words settled between us. Not heavy. Just final. I adjusted the folder in my hands, then stepped back, not away from them, but out of the space that had held us there. "I don't need anything else from you," I said. And I meant it. No anger. No bitterness. Just clarity. I turned and walked toward the door. Each step steady, measured, unhurried. The light from the hallway stretched across the floor, catching just enough to soften the edges of everything behind me. I didn't look back. Because there was nothing left to check. Nothing left to prove. Outside, the air felt different. Not lighter. Just open. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't carrying anything that didn't belong to me. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever had someone decide who you are without ever really seeing you, then you understand this moment. I want to know what you would have done in my place. Would you have stayed silent? Or would you have waited and let the truth speak when it mattered most? Leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Your voice matters here. And if stories like this speak to you, the quiet kind of strength, the kind that doesn't need to shout, then subscribe and stay with us. There are more stories ahead. And sometimes, the ones that start in silence end up being the ones we remember the most. Rainwater dripped from the hem of my dress onto the marble floor as 2 security guards grabbed my arms in front of 300 silent guests. Somewhere behind me, a champagne glass clinked against a plate. Someone laughed nervously. My future mother-in-law stood near the ballroom stage with one manicured hand pressed dramatically against her pearls, staring at the blood smeared across my sleeves like I'd dragged a corpse into her precious gala. I knew she would embarrass this family, she hissed. I opened my mouth to explain, but Richard Whitmore pointed toward the doors before I could speak. "Get her out, right now." The taller guard tightened his grip on my elbow. My shoulder ached from where I'd smashed through a car window less than an hour earlier. My hands still smelled like gasoline and blood. And then the ballroom doors swung open. A woman in a black cashmere coat stormed inside, rain blowing in behind her. Her face was pale with panic. The entire room recognized her instantly. Victoria Hale, one of the wealthiest women in Boston. And the moment her eyes landed on me, everything changed. "That woman," she said, her voice breaking, "that woman saved my granddaughter's life." 3 hours earlier, before the blood and humiliation and silence, I had been sitting alone in my car, trying to convince myself not to turn around. The windshield wipers pushed sheets of rain aside in uneven rhythms, while downtown Boston blurred under yellow streetlights. My fingers rested against the steering wheel, stiff from old injuries that never fully healed after Afghanistan. I could still hear Daniel's voice from earlier that afternoon. "Please come tonight, Evelyn. Just give them one more chance." One more chance. I almost laughed thinking about it. Richard and Margaret Whitmore had spent the last 2 years making it painfully clear I wasn't the woman they wanted marrying their son. It didn't matter that I was a captain in the U.S. Army Medical Corps. It didn't matter that I'd spent years patching shattered bodies together in field hospitals, while their country club friends debated golf memberships over lobster bisque. To them, I was still the daughter of a mechanic from Ohio who sometimes forgot which fork to use at formal dinners. Margaret once smiled directly at me over tea and said, "Military women always seem so hardened. I suppose war changes femininity." Another time, Richard asked if I planned to keep playing soldier after marrying Daniel. Playing soldier. I had been 27 years old when I held pressure against a 19-year-old private's chest, while mortars exploded less than 50 yards away. I remembered the smell of burning sandbags, the sound of someone screaming for morphine, the warm blood soaking through my gloves while that kid begged me to tell his mother he was brave. But according to Richard Whitmore, I was playing soldier. My phone buzzed through the center console. "Daniel." I stared at it for a second before answering through Bluetooth. "Hey, you're still coming, right?" he asked carefully. I could hear voices behind him, music, crystal glasses. The gala had already started. "I'm on my way." He exhaled softly, relieved. "Thank you." I waited. Part of me wanted him to say something else, something stronger. Something like, "If they disrespect you tonight, we leave together." But Daniel had spent his whole life smoothing tension instead of confronting it. "They're just stressed," he said quietly. "My father's company's under pressure right now." "That doesn't excuse cruelty." "I know," his voice softened. "I just want tonight to go well." I stared through the rain-smeared windshield. "So do I." After we hung up, I drove another 20 minutes through worsening weather. Thunder rolled low over the harbor. Traffic crawled near the financial district. Headlights reflected off flooded pavement in long silver streaks. That was when I saw the SUV. At first, it looked like a dark shape against the guardrail. Then lightning flashed overhead and I realized the vehicle was tilted halfway into a drainage ditch. Hazard lights blinked weakly through the rain. Training takes over before emotion does. People think heroism feels dramatic in the moment. It doesn't. It feels procedural, controlled. Your body moves before fear catches up. I pulled onto the shoulder and grabbed the trauma kit I kept in my trunk out of habit. The cold rain hit my face instantly as I ran toward the wreck. The front windshield was shattered. The driver, a woman maybe in her 30s, was slumped unconscious over the steering wheel. Airbags hung limp inside the cabin. And then I heard it. A child choking. I ran to the rear passenger side and saw a little girl strapped into her seat, convulsing violently. Oh God. Blood trickled down the side of her forehead. "Hey, sweetheart, stay with me," I said immediately, forcing calm into my voice. The rear door was jammed shut. I grabbed a tire iron from the muddy ground near the crash and smashed the side window hard enough that pain shot through my wrist. Glass exploded inward. The child screamed. It's okay, I'm here." Rain soaked through my dress within seconds as I climbed halfway into the vehicle. The smell inside was overwhelming: gasoline-deployed airbags, blood-burnt rubber. The girl's seizure worsened. I checked her airway first. Still breathing. Barely. "Come on, sweetheart," I whispered. My hands moved automatically steady despite the adrenaline flooding my chest. Tilt the head, monitor the pupils, keep her from aspirating, control bleeding, stabilize the neck as much as possible. The little girl couldn't have been older than 8. And suddenly, for one terrible second, she reminded me of my younger sister back home. Same dark curls, same frightened eyes. The child stopped moving. My stomach dropped. No, stay with me. I checked for breathing again. Weak. Too weak. I leaned closer, listening over the pounding rain and distant thunder while my own pulse hammered in my ears. Far away, sirens finally echoed through the storm. But I already knew those next few minutes would matter more than anything waiting for me at that gala. The little girl's lips had started turning blue by the time the ambulance finally reached us. Rain hammered against the overturned SUV so hard it sounded like gravel pouring from the sky. My knees were buried in cold mud beside the vehicle, and my entire body shook from adrenaline and exhaustion. One of my sleeves had ripped open on shattered glass, leaving a long cut across my forearm that I hadn't even noticed until blood mixed with the rainwater running down my hand. But none of that mattered. The only thing I could focus on was the child. "Stay with me, sweetheart," I kept saying softly while supporting her airway. "You're doing good. Just keep breathing for me." Her name was Lily. I'd learned that from the pink backpack crushed near the floorboard. There was a little stuffed rabbit hanging from the zipper soaked through with rainwater. The seizure finally eased, but her breathing remained shallow and irregular. One of the paramedics rushed over carrying equipment through the storm. "What do we have?" "Female, approximately 8 years old," I answered immediately. "Vehicle rollover, head trauma. Active seizure activity for at least 2 minutes when I arrived. Possible concussion, brief respiratory collapse." The medic looked at me sharply, instantly recognizing military precision in the way I spoke. "You medical?" "Army trauma." He nodded once. No more questions needed. The unconscious driver, the child's nanny, I later learned was extracted from the front seat while firefighters cut through twisted metal. Sirens painted the rain in flashes of red and blue. Steam hissed from the SUV's crushed engine. The little girl suddenly grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. Her eyes fluttered open just enough to find my face. "Don't leave," she whispered weakly. Something inside my chest tightened painfully. "I'm right here." She held on while the paramedics loaded her onto the stretcher. Even after they secured oxygen around her face, her fingers refused to let go of my sleeve. One of the medics gave me a sympathetic look. "You can ride with us if you're family." I almost said yes, but then my phone vibrated again. "Daniel." I looked toward the ambulance, toward the frightened little girl staring at me through the oxygen mask, then toward the glowing Boston skyline beyond the rain. Duty pulls people in different directions. Sometimes there's no right answer, only the choice you can live with afterward. I leaned down beside Lily one last time. "You're safe now," I told her gently. "These people are going to take care of you." Her small hand finally loosened from my sleeve. I stood in the rain watching the ambulance disappear into traffic before realizing what I looked like. My cream-colored evening dress was ruined. Blood streaked across the fabric from my chest to my knees. Mud splattered the hem. My hair had completely fallen loose from its pins, sticking damply to my face and neck. And I was already over an hour late. I should have gone home. Honestly, I almost did. But Daniel had begged me to come. And despite everything his parents thought about me, some stubborn part of me still believed maybe tonight could be different. Maybe people could surprise you. By the time I arrived at the Whitmore Gala, valet attendants stood beneath massive white awnings outside the Fairmont Copley Plaza, while luxury cars lined the entrance in glittering rows. Men in tuxedos and women wrapped in diamonds moved through the lobby beneath crystal chandeliers glowing gold against polished marble floors. The second I stepped out of my car, the valet froze. His eyes widened at the blood on my dress. "Ma'am, are you all right?" "I'm fine," I answered quickly. "Long story." The young man looked unconvinced but handed me my ticket silently. Inside, the hotel warmth hit my skin immediately. The scent of expensive perfumed champagne and fresh roses floated through the lobby. Somewhere nearby, a string quartet played softly. I caught my reflection briefly in one of the mirrored walls and almost stopped walking. I looked horrifying. There was dried blood on my collarbone. My mascara had washed halfway down my cheeks from the storm. One side of my dress clung darkly to my skin where rainwater hadn't dried yet. People stared as I crossed the lobby. Some with concern, others with disgust. The ballroom doors stood open ahead of me, glowing with warm light and laughter. I took one steadying breath and walked inside. The room fell silent almost immediately. It happened in waves. First, the people nearest the entrance noticed me. Then conversations began fading table by table until the entire ballroom slowly quieted beneath the soft music. Hundreds of eyes turned toward me. A waiter nearly dropped a tray of champagne glasses. At the far end of the room, Margaret Whitmore stood near the stage in a silver designer gown, surrounded by donors and investors. Richard Whitmore was beside her, laughing at something one of the board members had said. Then they saw me. Margaret's smile vanished instantly. For one suspended second, nobody moved. Daniel started toward me from across the ballroom, concern flashing across his face. "Evelyn." But his mother reached me first. "Oh my God," she whispered sharply, staring at my dress. "What on earth happened to you?" I stopped at an accident, I began calmly. "There was a little girl hurt and—" Margaret glanced around at the horrified guests before cutting me off. "You came here looking like this." The humiliation hit harder than I expected. Not because of what she said. Because I suddenly realized she wasn't worried about whether I was hurt. She was worried about the party. "I didn't have time to change," I answered quietly. Richard approached beside her, jaw tight with fury. "You're covered in blood." "Yes," I said evenly, "because a child almost died tonight." A few nearby guests exchanged uncomfortable looks, but Margaret lowered her voice and hissed, "Couldn't you have handled this privately? We have senators here, investors, reporters." I stared at her. For a moment, I genuinely couldn't find words. Daniel finally reached us. "Mom, stop." "No," Margaret snapped. "Look at her. This is exactly the kind of chaos I warned you about." Chaos. Not bravery. Not compassion. Not sacrifice. Chaos. Richard's face hardened as more guests continued staring openly now. "You've embarrassed this family enough," he said coldly. Something inside me went very still. I thought about the child's tiny fingers gripping my sleeve in the ambulance. I thought about Afghanistan. About boys bleeding out in desert tents while helicopters shook the ground beneath us. And suddenly this ballroom with its diamonds and champagne and shallow cruelty felt impossibly small. "I saved a little girl tonight," I said quietly. Margaret folded her arms. "And now you're making a spectacle of yourself." Daniel looked trapped between us, panic rising behind his eyes. "Dad, please." But Richard turned toward security near the entrance. "Escort her out." Daniel froze. That was the moment something in me finally broke, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a kind of exhausted clarity. Because the man I loved didn't move. He didn't stand beside me. He didn't say, "If she leaves, I leave too." He just stood there. 2 security guards approached carefully. One reached for my arm. "I can walk myself," I said. The ballroom had become unbearably quiet now, except for the soft clinking of silverware somewhere near the back tables. And then the doors opened. Wind rushed inside from the storm outside. A tall woman in a black coat entered with 2 suited bodyguards behind her. Rain glistened across her shoulders. Every wealthy person in that ballroom recognized her instantly. Victoria Hale. Conversation stopped completely. Her expression was pale with panic as she scanned the room desperately. Then her eyes landed on me, on the blood covering my dress, and suddenly her face crumpled with emotion. "That's her," she said, voice shaking. "That's the woman who saved Lily." For 3 full seconds, nobody in that ballroom moved. The security guard still had one hand lightly around my arm, though his grip loosened almost immediately. Margaret Whitmore looked like someone had drained the color from her body. Richard's expression hardened into confusion first, then calculation. But Victoria Hale never looked at either of them. She walked straight toward me. The room parted for her automatically. That kind of power doesn't need to announce itself. People feel it before a word is spoken. Even the orchestra had stopped playing. I suddenly became aware of how exhausted I was. My shoulders hurt. My knees still stung from kneeling on broken asphalt. Blood had dried stiff against my skin beneath the ballroom lights. I could smell smoke and rain lingering on my clothes among all the perfume and polished wealth surrounding me. Victoria stopped directly in front of me. Up close, she looked older than she did in magazines. Not weaker, just real. The kind of woman grief had carved into something sharper and quieter over the years. Her eyes filled as she looked at the blood on my sleeves. "You stayed with her," she whispered. I nodded once. She was scared. Victoria pressed trembling fingers against her mouth for a moment, like she was trying not to fall apart in front of strangers. Then, to everyone's shock, she stepped forward and wrapped both arms around me. The ballroom erupted into stunned murmurs. "Oh my God. That's Victoria Hale." She hugged her. My body froze from surprise before I slowly returned the embrace. I could feel her shaking slightly. "My granddaughter is alive because of you," she said against my shoulder. Across the room, I saw Richard Whitmore's entire posture change. Fear. Not guilt. Fear. Because every person in Boston's upper financial circles knew Hale Capital had been quietly reviewing Whitmore Development for a massive investment deal. Rumors about Whitmore's debt problems had circulated for months. And now the woman holding their future in her hands was standing in the middle of their gala, hugging the woman they had just publicly humiliated. Victoria finally pulled back and looked at my injured arm. "You're bleeding." "It's nothing serious. You should be at a hospital." I almost laughed softly at that. Occupational hazard. Her eyes narrowed slightly as though she recognized something familiar in my tone. One of her security men stepped closer. "Ma'am, the doctors are asking for you back at Mass General." Victoria nodded distractedly without taking her eyes off me. "How is Lily?" "Stable, sedated for observation." A visible wave of relief crossed her face. Margaret suddenly stepped forward, wearing the brittle smile wealthy people use when they're terrified. "Victoria," she said carefully, "we had no idea Evelyn was involved in all this." Victoria turned slowly toward her. And for the first time since entering the ballroom, her expression became cold. "No," she said quietly, "I don't believe you did." Silence spread again. Margaret tried another smile. "We were simply concerned for the guests. She arrived in such an alarming condition." Covered in my granddaughter's blood, Victoria replied. Margaret's lips parted, but no words came out. I stood there emotionally detached now, almost outside myself. Adrenaline exhaustion does strange things to the brain. Sounds become distant, faces blur around the edges. I noticed tiny details instead. The condensation sliding down untouched champagne glasses. The faint scent of cigar smoke clinging to Richard's tuxedo. Daniel standing 6 feet away looking sick with shame. Victoria turned back toward me. What's your name? Evelyn Carter. Ms. Carter, the neurosurgeon, told me another 5 or 6 minutes without intervention could have killed Lily. The room grew even quieter somehow. I looked down briefly. I just did what anyone should do. No, Victoria said immediately. Most people drive past. That line landed heavily because everyone there knew it was true. Especially them. Richard Whitmore finally stepped forward, attempting composure. Victoria, perhaps we should move this conversation somewhere more private. Her eyes shifted toward him with surgical precision. You called security on her. Richard hesitated. There was clearly a misunderstanding. No, Victoria said. There wasn't. Her voice never rose, that made it worse. I walked in here and saw 2 guards removing a woman who had just saved a child's life, while your guests stood around staring at her like she was trash on the bottom of their shoes. Nobody breathed. Margaret glanced nervously toward the surrounding investors, now pretending not to listen. Victoria continued calmly, Do you know what Lily told the paramedics before they sedated her? I shook my head slightly. She said, The army lady stayed because she didn't want me to die alone. Something cracked open painfully inside my chest. For a second, Afghanistan flashed through my mind again. A 19-year-old Marine gripping my hand under dim emergency lights. Please don't leave me, ma'am. Some memories never stop breathing. Victoria studied my face carefully, then asked quietly, You served overseas? Yes. Army. Medical Corps. Her expression shifted. My son was 1st Battalion Marines, she said softly. Fallujah, then Helmand Province. I saw it instantly then that look military families recognize in one another without explanation. The permanent grief hidden beneath polished surfaces. He died 11 years ago. I'm sorry, I said gently. Victoria nodded once. They told me he died protecting 2 younger soldiers during an evacuation. The ballroom around us had disappeared completely now. No music, no chatter, just silence and the sound of rain against distant windows. My son used to talk about army medics constantly, she continued quietly. Said they were the bravest people he ever saw because they ran toward suffering instead of away from it. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Across the room, Daniel looked at me differently now. Not as his fiancée caught in another conflict with his parents, but almost like he was seeing the full shape of my life for the first time. And somehow that hurt more. Victoria finally turned back toward Richard Whitmore. You know, she said calmly, I spent the drive here preparing to thank whoever saved Lily. Richard swallowed visibly. But instead, she continued, I arrived just in time to watch you humiliate her. No one moved. Then Victoria looked around the ballroom slowly, her gaze settling over the glittering tables, crystal chandeliers, and silent, wealthy guests. Incredible, she murmured. Hundreds of successful people in this room, and the only person here tonight with genuine character is the woman you tried to throw out. Margaret's face crumpled slightly. Daniel opened his mouth finally. Evelyn, But I looked at him, and whatever he saw in my expression stopped him cold. Because love can survive many things, but not standing alone while someone decides your worth in front of a room full of strangers. Victoria gently touched my injured sleeve again. Come with me, she said softly. You shouldn't spend another minute here. And for the first time all evening, the entire ballroom stepped aside to let me pass. The rain had slowed to a cold mist by the time Victoria Hale and I stepped into the private lounge adjoining the ballroom. The noise from the gala faded behind thick mahogany doors, replaced by the soft crackling of a fireplace and the muted hum of downtown traffic beyond the windows. Someone from hotel staff brought towels and a first aid kit without being asked. Wealth like Victoria's moved the world quietly. Doors opened before requests were spoken. I sat carefully on the edge of a leather chair while she poured 2 glasses of water with steady hands that still trembled ever so slightly beneath the surface. Your arm, she said. It looks worse than it is. That's what military people always say. There was dry humor in her voice now, but grief still lingered behind it. She handed me the glass and sat across from me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I could finally feel the exhaustion settling into my bones now that the adrenaline had nowhere left to go. My hands ached. My back hurt. And underneath all of it sat the hollow disappointment Daniel had left behind in that ballroom. Victoria broke the silence first. "You love my granddaughter already," she said quietly. I blinked. I met her an hour ago. "No," she replied gently. "You protected her. There's a difference." I looked down at the bloodstains on my ruined dress. "When children are scared," I said softly, "they remember who stayed calm." Victoria watched me carefully for a second before asking, "How long have the Whitmores treated you like that?" I gave a tired smile. "Long enough." She leaned back slowly. Richard Whitmore once spent 20 minutes lecturing a waiter at a charity dinner because the wine arrived late. That surprised a quiet laugh out of me despite everything. Victoria's expression hardened again. People tell you exactly who they are when they think money protects them from consequences. A knock interrupted us. One of Victoria's assistants entered carrying a tablet and several folders. "Ma'am, the board members from Hale Capital are asking whether tomorrow's Whitmore meeting is still happening." Victoria didn't even hesitate. "Number." The assistant nodded immediately. "Understood." He disappeared again. I stared at her, that fast. Victoria met my eyes directly. "Evelyn, I do business with people whose judgment I trust. Tonight I watched Richard Whitmore publicly degrade the woman who saved a child's life because she threatened his image." Her tone stayed calm. That somehow made the words feel heavier. "That tells me everything I need to know about how he treats people when cameras aren't watching." Back inside the ballroom, faint music resumed awkwardly through the walls. Someone was trying desperately to salvage the evening. Victoria shook her head slightly. They built their reputation on philanthropy and family values. Boston society loves that performance. She paused. But real character appears when something inconvenient walks through the door. I thought about Daniel then. About the way he'd frozen. The memory hurt more now than Richard or Margaret ever could. Victoria noticed my silence. "You're thinking about him." "Yes." And I took a long breath. "I think Daniel loves me," I admitted quietly, "but I also think he's spent his entire life surviving his parents instead of confronting them." Victoria nodded slowly like she understood that kind of family too well. "My husband came from old political money," she said, "the kind that teaches children obedience before self-respect." Outside the lounge windows, headlights crawled through wet city streets below us. "When my son enlisted," she continued softly, "his grandfather called him a disgrace to the family." I looked up. Victoria smiled faintly, though sadness lingered in it. Funny how powerful men panic when someone chooses service over status. That line settled deep inside me. Because she understood. Not just the military. The loneliness that sometimes came with it. A second knock sounded. This time it was Daniel. Victoria glanced at me before quietly standing. "I'll give you a moment." She walked past him without expression and closed the door behind her. Daniel remained near the entrance for several seconds, looking wrecked. His bow tie hung loose now. His face had lost all color. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. I didn't answer right away. Not because I wanted revenge. Because I was too tired to pretend his apology fixed anything. Daniel stepped closer carefully. "Evelyn, I didn't know what to do." The words hit harder than shouting would have. I looked at him quietly. That was the problem. Pain flashed across his face. "They blindsided me." "No," I replied softly. "They've treated me this way for 2 years." He looked down. And there it was. Truth. Not cruelty, not malice, just weakness. The kind that destroys people slowly because it waits too long to become courage. "I love you," he whispered. Tears burned unexpectedly behind my eyes, then not because I doubted him, but because I believed him. And sometimes love alone still isn't enough. "You stood there while they had security drag me out," I said quietly. Daniel rubbed a hand over his face. I was trying to stop things from escalating. I almost smiled sadly at that. "That's what you've always done, Daniel. You manage tension, you smooth things over, you survive your parents." I looked directly at him. But someday you have to decide whether you're a son first or a man first. He looked shattered. And part of me hated causing that expression because despite everything, Daniel wasn't a bad person. He was simply raised inside a system where keeping peace mattered more than defending truth. The ballroom doors burst open somewhere in the distance then. Raised voices echoed faintly through the hallway. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Victoria just informed my father she's pulling out of the investment deal. I said nothing. She also told 3 board members exactly why. There it was. The real collapse beginning. Whitmore Development had quietly been bleeding money for over a year due to over-leveraged luxury projects. Hale Capital's backing would have stabilized everything. Without it, I already knew what would happen. Investors panic fast when confidence disappears. Daniel sat heavily across from me, suddenly looking much older than 38. My father's going to blame you. No, I said quietly, he's going to blame himself, eventually. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Then Daniel asked the question both of us already knew the answer to. Is this over? The fireplace crackled softly between us. I thought about every dinner where I'd swallowed humiliation to keep peace. Every backhanded comment Margaret disguised as sophistication. Every moment Daniel almost defended me but stopped halfway. Then I remembered a frightened little girl gripping my sleeve in the rain asking me not to leave her alone. And somehow that child had shown me more clarity in one night than this relationship had given me in 2 years. I slowly slipped the engagement ring from my finger. Daniel's face crumpled instantly. I wanted you to choose me without hesitation, I whispered. The ring rested cold and heavy in my palm. But you never did. 3 weeks after the gala, I stood in full dress uniform beneath soft autumn sunlight, outside the Hale Foundation Center for Military Families, while volunteers carried donation boxes through the courtyard behind me. The air smelled like coffee-fallen leaves and fresh paint. Construction crews were still finishing one side of the building, but inside the counseling offices were already open for veterans and military children. Life moves strangely after public humiliation. At first there's silence. Then whispers. Then consequences. By Monday morning, clips from the Whitmore Gala had spread across social media after one of the guests leaked cell phone footage of Richard ordering security to remove me. By Tuesday, Boston news outlets were running stories about the Army captain who saved a child before being thrown out of a millionaire gala. People love scandals involving rich families. But what truly damaged the Whitmores wasn't the embarrassment. It was the contrast. A blood-covered military officer who stopped to save a child, versus wealthy philanthropists worried about table linens and appearances. That kind of story sticks to people, especially older Americans who still understand what service means. Whitmore Development lost 2 investors within 10 days. One board member resigned quietly. Another demanded Richard step down as acting chairman until reputational concerns stabilized. The newspapers called it unfortunate timing. But everyone in Boston knew the truth. Character had finally become expensive. I hadn't spoken to Daniel since the night I returned the ring. Not because I hated him. Oddly enough, hatred would have been easier. Instead, I missed him in small, painful ways that arrived unexpectedly. Hearing jazz music in restaurants he would have liked. Passing bookstores we used to wander through on quiet Sundays. Reaching for my phone before remembering there was no reason to call anymore. Some endings happen all at once. Others echo for months. Victoria Hale found me 2 days after the gala sitting alone at a diner near the VA hospital wearing sweatpants and drinking terrible coffee after a 14-hour shift. No makeup. Hair tied back. Emotionally exhausted. She slid into the booth across from me wearing a camel-colored coat that probably cost more than my first car and said, "You look exactly like my son used to after back-to-back rotations." Then she ordered pancakes for both of us without asking. That was the beginning. Now, weeks later, she stood near the foundation entrance speaking with donors, while Lily chased Bubbles across the courtyard with several other military kids. The scar near Lily's hairline had mostly healed. Every so often she glanced over at me just to make sure I was still there. Trauma does that to children. Truthfully, it does it to adults too. "Captain Carter." I turned to see one of the volunteers approaching. "We're ready for the opening remarks." I nodded once. As I started toward the podium, I noticed a familiar figure standing near the edge of the parking lot. Daniel. For one suspended moment, neither of us moved. He looked thinner than I remembered. Tired, the kind of tired money can't hide. Victoria noticed him too, but wisely said nothing as she walked inside with the others. Daniel approached slowly after the crowd disappeared into the building. I wasn't sure you'd want to see me. I wasn't sure either. A sad smile flickered across his face. The wind stirred fallen leaves across the pavement between us. How's your father? I asked quietly. Daniel let out a breath through his nose. Angry, humiliated, looking for someone to blame. And your mother? She still thinks this whole thing was a misunderstanding. That almost made me laugh. Almost. Daniel shoved his hands into his coat pockets. I moved out. I looked at him carefully then. You finally stood up to them. Too late. Neither of us argued with that. For a moment we simply stood there listening to distant traffic and children laughing inside the foundation building. I loved you, he said finally. The honesty in his voice hurt. Because I believed him completely. I know. And I should have protected you. I swallowed slowly. Yes, I answered softly. You should have. His eyes reddened slightly, though he held himself together. I kept thinking if I could balance everyone long enough, eventually they'd accept you. He shook his head bitterly. I didn't realize asking you to tolerate disrespect was its own kind of betrayal. That line settled heavily between us. Growth often arrives wrapped in regret. I stepped closer then, not romantically, not cruelly either. Just honestly. You were raised to keep peace at any cost, I said. But peace without integrity becomes cowardice eventually. Daniel nodded once like he'd already learned that lesson the hard way. I'm trying to become better than them. I hope you do. He looked at me for another long moment before asking quietly, could there ever be another chance? There it was. The question both of us already knew the answer to. Behind us I could hear Lily laughing inside the building. Victoria's voice floated faintly through the open doors. Somewhere above the city church bells rang noon across Boston. I smiled sadly. Some people come into our lives forever, I said softly. Others come into our lives to change us. Daniel lowered his eyes. Then, after a long silence, he nodded. Take care of yourself, Evelyn. You too. He walked away slowly across the parking lot without looking back again. And strangely, watching him leave no longer felt like losing something. It felt like surviving something. An hour later, the foundation auditorium filled with veterans, spouses, social workers, donors, and military families, balancing restless children on their laps. I stood at the podium in uniform while sunlight streamed through tall windows behind the audience. Victoria sat in the front row beside Lily. In her hands rested an old photograph. After the ceremony, she showed it to me privately in her office. A young Marine smiling beside a dusty Humvee somewhere overseas. Her son. He would have liked you, she said quietly. Emotion tightened unexpectedly in my throat. Victoria touched the photo gently. After he died, I spent years surrounded by powerful people pretending influence mattered most. She looked up at me. Then you walked into that ballroom covered in blood from saving a child. Tears burned behind my eyes. You reminded me what real honor looks like. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then Lily burst into the office holding construction paper stars and immediately wrapped herself around my waist. Look what I made. I laughed softly through the emotion and crouched beside her. And in that moment, surrounded by sunlight and laughter and imperfect healing, I understood something that had taken me years to learn. The richest people in the world are not the ones who protect their status. They're the ones who still protect others after life gives them every reason not to. If this story moved you, I'd truly love to hear where you're watching from and what part stayed with you the most. Stories like this remind us that dignity, courage, and kindness still matter, especially in a world obsessed with appearances. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about resilience, family, and unexpected justice, make sure you subscribe and join us for the next journey. There are so many more stories waiting to be told. My father didn't raise his voice often. He didn't need to. He had a way of cutting through a room with a sentence so clean it left no blood on the floor, just silence. But that morning in courtroom 11C, he didn't bother with precision. She never served, he said, each word sharpened by something close to contempt. She stole our name. Every bit of it is a lie. The sound didn't echo, it landed. People turned, not slowly, all at once. A ripple of heads-eyes pens pausing mid-note. Someone in the back let out a quiet breath like they'd been waiting for exactly that line. I didn't look at him. I looked at the bench. At the woman seated above us in a dark robe, her posture still her gaze unreadable. Judge Marion Vale had been quiet all morning. Not indifferent, there's a difference, but contained like someone holding a door closed against a storm no one else could hear. I didn't flinch, I didn't speak, I just watched her. And I waited. Because something in the way her eyes settled on me just for a fraction longer than necessary felt less like judgment and more like recognition. The courtroom smelled faintly of lemon polish and paper that had been handled too many times. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a thin electric buzz that never quite disappeared even when people spoke. The air was cold in that institutional way, as if warmth had been deliberately engineered out of it. 6 feet separated me from the people who gave me life. On the plaintiff's side, Daniel Whitmore, my father, immaculate as always. Navy suit, crisp, white shirt, tie, knotted with practiced ease. His hair was silver now, but controlled combed back in a way that suggested discipline rather than age. Beside him sat my mother Evelyn, pearl earrings, neutral expression, the same posture she used at charity luncheons, board meetings, funerals, appropriate, contained, untouchable. Their attorney stood just slightly forward, a man with coastal polish, and the easy confidence of someone who believed the story he was telling was already halfway to being accepted as truth. On the defense side, my side, there was only me. No stack of documents, no legal team flanking me, no carefully tabbed binders. Just a charcoal coat, my hair pulled back tight, and my hands folded in my lap so they wouldn't give away the small, involuntary tremor that lived somewhere beneath my skin. My uniform wasn't with me. It was folded at home, pressed clean, tucked inside a cedar chest at the foot of my bed. But I could still feel it, the weight of it, the seam of the shoulder patch that had once sat against my arm, the faint ghost of sand that never quite left your memory no matter how many times you washed. Kandahar had a smell, dust and heat and something metallic that clung to the back of your throat. That scent never really leaves you. Even here. Even now. The bailiff called the case again, voice steady, practiced. Whitmore versus Whitmore. A pause followed. Not long, just long enough for the absurdity of it to settle in the room. My father leaned forward slightly, his hand resting on the table as if anchoring himself to something solid. When he spoke again, his voice had lowered, but it hadn't softened. She's built an entire life on a fabrication, he said. Military service that never happened. Records that don't exist. Benefits she had no right to claim. She has used our name, my name, to give credibility to a lie. His lawyer picked up the thread smoothly. Your Honor, we will demonstrate that the defendant has knowingly misrepresented herself as a United States Army officer. We will show that there is no verifiable record of her enlistment under her Social Security number in any publicly accessible Department of Defense database. We will show financial records. Paper slid across the table, a soft, deliberate sound, indicating she has received veteran-related benefits over a period of several years. We will also present witness testimony suggesting a pattern of unstable behavior and attention-seeking narratives consistent with fabricated trauma. The words were clinical, clean. They had been chosen carefully. Unstable, fabricated, attention-seeking. Each one placed exactly where it would do the most damage. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct him. Silence, I had learned, unsettles people more than argument. It forces them to sit with what they've said instead of pushing against resistance. But to them, my silence meant something else. Guilt. Confession. Proof. I could feel it in the way people shifted in their seats, in the way a reporter in the second row tilted her head, pen poised, as if she'd already decided which version of the story would be easier to write. Because on paper, my father's version made sense. On paper, I didn't exist. I was 18 when I left that house. Barely an adult. My head shaved down to something that felt more like a statement than a haircut. I remember standing in the doorway with a duffel bag slung over my shoulder, waiting for something I couldn't quite name. A hug, maybe. Or at least acknowledgement. My mother stood in the kitchen, her back partially turned, as if the angle itself could soften the moment into something less significant. My father didn't get up from his chair. "Just don't embarrass us," he said, not looking away from the paper in his hands. That was it. No ceremony, no pride, no question about where I was going or why. I told myself it didn't matter. That I was stepping into something bigger than that house, bigger than their approval. That one day I would come back with something they couldn't dismiss. I didn't understand then that dismissal wasn't about evidence. It was about willingness. And my father had never been willing to see me as anything other than a deviation from the version of a daughter he found acceptable. "Miss Whitmore," the judge's voice cut gently through the room, bringing me back. It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. "Yes, Your Honor," I said. My voice sounded steady, even to me. "You've chosen to represent yourself in this matter." "Yes, ma'am." A slight nod, no judgment in it, just acknowledgement. "And you understand the nature of the allegations being made against you?" "I do." Another pause. She studied me then. Not the way the others had, scanning for weakness, for cracks, but as if she were placing something, aligning it with a memory just out of reach. "Very well," she said finally, "we'll proceed." The prosecution continued. More documents, more language designed to sound definitive. No photographic evidence of service. No discharge papers available for independent verification. No commanding officer willing to come forward under her name. Each point landed like a nail being driven into something already assumed to be true. They were building a picture. A woman who had come back from nowhere with stories no one could confirm. A daughter who had always been difficult, now seeking validation through something dramatic enough to command attention. My father didn't look at me. Not once. He kept his gaze forward, his jaw set in that familiar line that used to mean he was disappointed. Now it meant something else. Determination. He believed this. Or maybe belief wasn't the right word. He had decided it was true. And that was enough. During a brief recess, I allowed myself a glance in his direction. He was sipping water from a clear bottle, his posture relaxed, almost satisfied. My mother leaned in slightly, whispering something I couldn't hear. Her hand rested lightly on his arm. They looked like a couple waiting for a verdict they were confident would go their way. As if this were routine. As if erasing me were just another item on a list of necessary corrections. I looked away first, not because I couldn't hold his gaze, but because I no longer needed to. When the session resumed, their attorney stepped forward again, his voice carrying easily. "Your Honor, if the defendant truly served, there would be verifiable evidence. A unit, a record, a chain of command willing to confirm her claims. But instead we have silence." He turned just enough to gesture in my direction without fully facing me. "We have a narrative unsupported by fact. We have myth." A murmur moved through the room. Subtle but present. I felt it, the shift. The weight of assumption settling into place. I didn't respond. I just lifted my eyes once more to the bench. Judge Marion Vale had gone very still. Her fingers rested against the wood, unmoving. Her gaze wasn't on the attorney anymore. It was on me. Not questioning. Not skeptical. Something else. Something older than this room. Slower. Heavier. As if somewhere beneath the layers of procedure and distance, she had just recognized a detail that didn't belong to a story, but to a memory. And for the first time since my father had opened his mouth that morning, I felt something shift. Not in the room. Not yet. But in the space between what was being said and what had actually happened. I held her gaze. And I waited. Because if there was one thing I had learned both in that house and far beyond it, it was this. Truth doesn't always arrive when it's called. But when it does, it doesn't ask permission. I learned early that in my father's house, affection wasn't given, it was earned, itemized, and quietly withdrawn when it no longer served a purpose. There were rules, though no one ever wrote them down. You didn't ask questions that made people uncomfortable. You didn't contradict him in front of others. You didn't choose a path that reflected poorly on the name he had spent decades polishing. And above all, you didn't become something he couldn't explain. My brother Mason understood that instinctively. He moved through life like a well-rehearsed answer, Varsity letters. Easy smile. A business degree from Duke that my father mentioned in conversations the way other people referenced weather casually, but often enough that everyone remembered. Mason knew how to be seen. I knew how to notice. Which in my father's world were not the same thing. I was the one who read too much, asked too many questions, and never quite mastered the art of softening my edges for other people's comfort. In family photos, I stood where I was told, but I didn't lean in. I didn't perform closeness I didn't feel. That alone was enough to mark me as difficult. By the time I was 16, the gap between what my father expected and who I actually was had widened into something unspoken but permanent. He stopped correcting me, stopped advising, stopped trying. It wasn't acceptance. It was disengagement. When I enlisted, he called it a phase. Rebellion has a way of burning itself out, he told one of his colleagues over dinner, as if I weren't sitting 3 feet away. She'll come back to something more. Appropriate. Appropriate. It was his favorite word for anything that fit inside his understanding of the world. The Army didn't. I didn't enlist to prove him wrong. Not exactly. I enlisted because it was the first thing that felt real, something that didn't depend on his approval or his interpretation, something with consequences that couldn't be negotiated away over a polite conversation. Basic training stripped everything down. Name, hair, habits, assumptions. What was left was simpler, harder, more honest. There's a clarity in being pushed past your limits by people who don't care who your father is. No one there knew the Whitmore name. No one cared. For the first time, that felt like relief. The first deployment came faster than I expected. Kandahar wasn't what people imagine when they hear it spoken from a distance. It wasn't a single place. It was layers of dust and heat and tension that never fully dissipated. The air itself felt alert, as if it were waiting for something to break. I wasn't infantry. I wasn't leading patrols through villages or clearing buildings. I was attached to a medical evacuation unit operating in coordination with routes that didn't appear on standard maps. Our job was simple in theory. Get in, stabilize, get out. In practice, it meant arriving at the worst moments of someone else's day. Sometimes of their life. You don't remember every face. You can't. Your mind learns to protect itself in ways you don't notice until later. But you remember details, a voice, a hand gripping yours too tightly, the way someone says your name when they're trying not to panic. You remember the wait, always the wait. The night everything changed didn't announce itself. Convoys don't come with warnings, they come with routine, repetition, the false comfort of doing something enough times that it starts to feel predictable. We were 3 vehicles deep when the blast hit. The sound was wrong, not louder than expected, just closer, immediate in a way that bypassed thought and went straight to reaction. Training took over. Movement, assessment, triage. There was no time to process anything beyond what was in front of you, no space for fear. That came later if it came at all. I remember the heat first, then the smell burnt metal, something sharper underneath it. Someone shouting coordinates, someone else calling out for a medic who wasn't answering. And then I was moving. Hands on a body, pressure where there was too much blood, instructions I didn't remember forming leaving my mouth like they had been waiting there all along. Stay with me. Don't close your eyes. Look at me. I said those things to strangers, to people whose names I didn't know, whose lives I would never see beyond that moment. But that night one of those faces stayed. Not because it was different, because of what came after. I didn't talk about Kandahar when I came home. Not because I didn't want to, because there was nowhere for it to go. You can't place that kind of experience into a room where people are discussing dinner plans and social calendars. It doesn't fit. It sits there heavy and out of place until someone changes the subject or pretends it was never brought up. So I learned not to bring it up. 3 years passed before I returned home for more than a few days at a time. By then, the fractures had settled into something stable, predictable. I arrived with a duffel bag, a letter of commendation, and a bronze star tucked into the inner pocket of my coat. I didn't lead with any of it. I knocked on the door like a guest. My mother answered. She looked at me through the peephole first. I could hear the faint shift of weight on the other side before the door opened halfway. "Oh," she said, "you're back. No surprise, no relief, just acknowledgement. I stepped inside. The house smelled the same, lemon cleaner, something baked earlier in the day, the quiet hum of central air. My father was in the living room seated in his usual chair. He looked up briefly. "Do you still have health insurance?" he asked. That was his first question. Not where I had been, not what had happened. Logistics. Practicalities. Things he could categorize and resolve. I stood there for a moment waiting for something else to follow. It didn't. I stayed a week. Long enough to confirm what I had already suspected. Nothing in that house had shifted to accommodate who I had become. There was no space for it, no curiosity, no attempt to reconcile the version of me they had held onto with the person standing in front of them. At dinner, conversations flowed around me. Mason's new job, a charity event my mother was organizing, a colleague of my father's who had recently published something worth reading. No one asked about the army. Not directly. Not indirectly. It was as if that part of my life existed behind glass. Visible, perhaps, but not something they were willing to touch. After a while, I stopped expecting them to. When I moved out, it wasn't dramatic. No confrontation, no ultimatum. Just a quiet decision made over coffee in the early morning, the kind where the light comes in through the window at an angle that makes everything feel temporarily clear. I found a small studio near the river. The floors creaked, the walls were thin, but it was mine. I volunteered at a trauma clinic that didn't ask for explanations. They didn't need them. The people who came through those doors carried their own versions of silence. There was an understanding there that didn't require translation. Through a legal aid group, I filed for veteran benefits. It wasn't straightforward. Parts of my service record had been processed through channels that didn't align cleanly with civilian databases. There were notations, flags, references to classifications I didn't have clearance to revisit. But eventually, with enough documentation and enough patience, the system recognized what it needed to. Or at least enough of it. I didn't push further. I wasn't looking for recognition. Just stability. The letter arrived on a gray morning in January. Certified mail. My name written in a hand I recognized immediately. I stood in the doorway longer than necessary, the envelope still sealed, something tight forming in my chest that I couldn't quite name. When I opened it, the language was exactly what I expected. Formal, precise, distant. Daniel Whitmore versus Elena Whitmore. The claim was laid out in clean, structured paragraphs. Accusations of fraud, identity misrepresentation, unauthorized receipt of benefits, damage to family reputation. It read less like a father addressing his daughter, and more like a man correcting a public record. I sat down at the small kitchen table and read it twice. Not because I didn't understand it the first time. Because part of me still believed there had to be something I was missing. A misunderstanding, a miscommunication. Something that could be resolved with a conversation. But there was no invitation to talk. No request for clarification. Just a summons. He hadn't just chosen not to see me. He had chosen to define me. In a way that made my existence inconvenient. And then he had decided to remove that inconvenience. Legally. Publicly. Permanently. I didn't feel anger right away. That came later. What I felt first was something quieter. Colder. Like a realization settling into place after years of being just out of reach. My father didn't need me to be a liar because he believed I was one. He needed me to be a liar because the alternative required him to confront something he had spent too long avoiding. Something about who I had become. Or who he had been when I needed him to see me. Back in the courtroom, as their attorney finished outlining his argument, I could feel the weight of that realization sitting just beneath the surface. They had spent years erasing me in private. Now they were asking the court to make it official. To turn absence into evidence. To turn silence into proof. I lifted my eyes once more to the bench. Judge Marion Vale hadn't moved. But something in her expression had shifted. Subtle, almost imperceptible. Like a memory pressing forward against restraint. And for the first time since this began, I understood something with complete clarity. My father wasn't the only one in this room who knew more than they were saying. The afternoon light shifted just enough to turn the courtroom windows into pale mirrors. Faces blurred against the glass spectators, reporters, the quiet outline of a cousin I hadn't seen since I was 15. Everyone watching a story they thought they understood. On paper it was simple. A father correcting a lie. A daughter exposed. That was the version being built piece by piece with careful language and well-placed doubt. And I was sitting at the center of it, silent. "Your Honor," my father's attorney said, stepping forward with a file in his hand, "we'd like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit 7. He didn't look at me when he spoke. He didn't need to. This is a certified report from a civilian-accessible Department of Defense database. We conducted a search using the defendant's social security number and full legal name. There is no record of enlistment, no active duty history, no discharge documentation available through standard verification channels." He let that settle. "No record," he repeated. The phrase echoed differently the second time. Not just an absence, a conclusion. The kind people were trained to trust. A few heads nodded, subtle, controlled, the way people agree without wanting to seem too eager. I didn't move. Additionally, he continued, "We have obtained financial statements indicating that the defendant has received monthly deposits associated with veteran assistance programs, housing credits, therapy subsidies, benefits designated for individuals with verified service-related trauma." He placed another document down. "The question before the court is not merely whether these benefits were received, it is whether they were received under false pretenses." False pretenses? I felt the words pass over me like something cold. Not sharp, not immediate. Just steady. "Miss Whitmore," he said, turning toward me for the first time, "would you care to explain to the court how you obtained these benefits?" The room quieted. It wasn't loud before, but this was different. Focused. Anticipating. I could feel it, every pair of eyes, every assumption waiting for confirmation. I lifted my head. "I filed through a legal aid group," I said. My voice carried evenly. "Using the documentation available to me." "And that documentation would be," he pressed. "Restricted," I said. A flicker of something crossed his face. Not surprise. Opportunity. "Restricted," he repeated as if testing the word. "So the court is expected to accept that your entire claim to military service rests on documents that cannot be independently verified." I didn't answer immediately. Not because I didn't have one. Because I knew how it would sound. "Yes," I said. A murmur moved through the room, louder this time, less controlled. I heard someone shift in their seat, a pen scratching faster across paper. The narrative was tightening. My father leaned back slightly, his expression unchanged. This was what he had been waiting for. A moment that sounded like confirmation. He didn't smile. He never did not in situations like this, but there was a stillness in him that I recognized. Satisfaction held carefully beneath the surface. "Let's be clear," the attorney said, his tone sharpening just enough to draw a line. "You are asking this court to believe that you served in the United States Army in a capacity significant enough to warrant both commendation and ongoing benefits. Yet there is no publicly accessible record of your service. No unit willing to come forward under your name. No commanding officer prepared to testify." He paused. "No verifiable evidence." He let the silence do the rest. "Just your word." Just your word. I let the phrase sit there. It sounded smaller than it was, less than what it carried. Because my word wasn't just a statement. It was the sum of everything I had done in places no one in that room had ever seen. Everything I couldn't bring into this space without breaking something I had sworn to protect. But none of that translated here. Here it was absence. Here it was doubt. I shifted slightly in my chair, my hand still folded, my posture unchanged. Across the room, a reporter leaned forward, eyes narrowed as if trying to catch the exact moment I would break. I didn't give it to her. The judge hadn't spoken. Not since the questioning began. But I could feel her attention. Not the kind that watches for mistakes. The kind that listens for something beneath the words. "Miss Whitmore," the attorney continued, If you truly served, there would be people living, verifiable individuals who could confirm your presence, your role, your actions. He took a step closer. Where are they? The question landed harder than the others. Not because I didn't have an answer. Because I did. Too many. Faces, voices, names that came with images I didn't let myself revisit unless I had to. Some of them were gone. Some of them had moved on into lives that didn't include courtrooms and public testimony. And some of them were tied to operations that were never meant to be discussed outside very specific channels. I looked up, not at him, at the bench, at Judge Marion Vale. Her expression hadn't changed, but her hand had. It rested against the wood of the bench, fingers slightly curled as if holding on to something. "I'm here," I said quietly. It wasn't the answer he wanted. He frowned slightly. "I'm sorry." "I'm here," I repeated. "That's not what I asked," he said, a note of impatience slipping through. "No," I said, "it isn't." I held his gaze for a moment, just long enough to let him see that I understood exactly what he was doing. Then I looked back at the judge. There was a shift. Small, but real. Her eyes moved not away from me but inward, as if aligning something. A detail. A memory. Something that had been out of place until now. "Your Honor," the attorney said, turning back toward the bench, "the plaintiff's position remains clear. Without verifiable evidence, the defendant's claims amount to narrative. And narrative, no matter how compelling, does not meet the standard required for the benefits she has received or the identity she has constructed. Narrative. My life reduced to a story. Something told. Something doubted. Something optional." The judge inhaled slowly. I saw it, the rise and fall of her shoulders, controlled, deliberate. She glanced down at the documents in front of her, then back up. Not at the attorney. At me. "Miss Whitmore," she said, her voice even during your service, "were you ever assigned to a unit operating outside standard reporting structures?" The question landed differently. Not for the room. For me. "Yes, ma'am," I said. A flicker again, subtle but unmistakable. "Can you elaborate?" she asked. "No, ma'am." Another pause. "Not because you are unwilling," she said. "No, ma'am." "Because you are unable." "Yes, ma'am." The room shifted again. Confusion this time, unease. This wasn't following the expected path. She nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something to herself. "Was there," she continued, "an incident involving a convoy and an IED detonation during your time in Kandahar?" The air changed. Not dramatically, but enough. I felt it in my chest before I fully processed the words. "Yes, ma'am," I said. My voice didn't waver, but something inside me did. "Following that incident," she said, "were you involved in providing immediate medical intervention to personnel on site?" The memory came back sharper this time. Heat, noise, the weight of someone in my hands. "Yes, ma'am." Her gaze held mine. "Do you recall," she asked, "a secondary extraction involving a legal liaison attached to the operation?" The room was quiet. Too quiet. Because no one else understood what she was asking. But I did. I swallowed once. "Her arm was hit," I said, "high on the shoulder, arterial bleed. We had to stabilize before airlift." A pause. "She kept asking for a report log," I added. Wouldn't let it go even when she was fading. The corner of the judge's mouth moved. Not a smile. Recognition. "I remember," she said softly. The words didn't carry far. But they didn't need to. They weren't for the room. They were for me. The attorney shifted, clearly uncertain. "Your Honor, I'm not sure how this line of questioning." She raised a hand. He stopped. Not because he agreed. Because something in her tone made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. She looked back down at the bench for a moment. Then up again. Her eyes steadier now. Resolved. "Counselor," she said, her voice returning to its formal cadence, "you asked where the proof was." A pause. "You may want to reconsider the scope of that question." The room held its breath. And for the first time since the case began, the version of the story my father had built, clean, controlled, unquestioned, began to show the first fine fracture. The fracture didn't sound like anything at first. No crack, no sharp intake of breath. Just a subtle misalignment in the rhythm of the room, like a metronome slipping half a beat off time. People felt it before they understood it. You could see it in the way shoulders stiffened, in the way the attorney's confidence shifted into something more cautious, more deliberate. My father noticed it too. He leaned forward slightly, his fingers pressing into the table, his posture tightening not in panic but in control. He was recalculating, adjusting, the way he always did when a conversation didn't move in the direction he intended. But this wasn't a conversation, and it wasn't his room anymore. "Your Honor," his attorney began, forcing a lightness into his tone that didn't quite hold with respect. Anecdotal recollections, however sincere, cannot substitute for verifiable documentation. The court must rely on... Counselor. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The single word settled over the room with a weight that pressed everything else down. He stopped. Not mid-sentence, mid-thought. Judge Marion Vale didn't look at him. She looked at me. And for the first time since the proceedings began, she didn't look like a judge weighing arguments. She looked like someone remembering something she had tried very hard not to forget. "You asked where the proof was," she said again, slower this time, each word placed with care. "You asked for a verifiable account, a witness, a confirmation that could withstand scrutiny." She rose to her feet. The movement was unhurried, deliberate. The kind of motion that doesn't seek attention but commands it anyway. The room shifted with her. Chairs creaked. Someone in the back straightened instinctively, as if called to attention by something older than protocol. My father's attorney glanced at the clerk, then back at the bench, uncertainty now visible in the tightness around his eyes. "Your Honor, if I may." "You may not," she said. Still calm. Still measured. But final. She stepped forward from behind the bench. That alone was enough to break the rhythm of the room. Judges don't do that. They remain elevated, removed, contained within the structure of the proceedings. She didn't. She moved into the space, into the same air we were breathing. And then slowly she reached for the front of her robe. The fabric was dark, heavy, designed to conceal, to standardize, to strip away individuality in favor of authority. Her fingers found the fastening at the collar. There was a moment, brief, suspended, where no one seemed to understand what was happening. And then she undid it. One motion. Clean. She slipped the robe from her shoulders. The sound it made as it fell was soft, almost nothing. But the absence it created, that was loud. Beneath the robe, she wore a simple blouse, sleeves rolled just enough to reveal the line of her forearm. And there, just below the shoulder where the fabric pulled back slightly as she moved. A scar. Not recent, not clean.
Old.
The kind that doesn't fade completely no matter how much time passes. The kind that tells a story without needing to be explained. "This," she said, her voice steady as what you're asking me to disregard. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the air felt different, thicker, heavier, as if it were waiting. "I did not intend," she continued, "to introduce personal history into these proceedings. It is not standard practice, it is not encouraged, and it is not something I take lightly." Her gaze shifted then. From me. To my father. "For the record," she said, "I will clarify the relevance." She took another step forward. "Years ago, before I ever wore this robe, before I ever sat on this bench, I was assigned as a legal liaison to a joint operation in Kandahar. My role was observational, administrative, detached." A pause. That detachment did not survive contact with reality. I didn't breathe. Not fully. Because I knew where she was going. And I knew what it would cost her to say it. "There was an incident," she said, "a convoy, an IED detonation, immediate casualties." Her hand lifted almost unconsciously toward the scar. "I was not meant to be in the primary response zone. I was not equipped for it. I was not trained for it." Another pause. "But I was there." Her eyes met mine. "And I would not be here now if she hadn't been." The room broke. Not into chaos. Into silence so complete it felt like something had been removed. Sound, movement, certainty. All of it. Gone. The defendant, she said, her voice tightening just enough to carry something beneath the control, was the first to reach me. She identified the injury, applied pressure, stabilized the bleed long enough for evacuation. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. She did not ask who I was. She did not hesitate. She did not wait for instruction. A breath. She acted. My father shifted. It was small, barely noticeable. But I saw it. The first crack. Not in the story. In him. I have the scar, she said. I have the medical record, and I have the memory of a young officer who held an artery closed with her hands while everything around us burned. She let that settle. Not as a statement, as fact. The woman you have described to this court as unstable, as fraudulent, as attention-seeking, her voice sharpened just slightly, is the reason I lived long enough to become the judge you now stand before. No one wrote. No one whispered. Even the reporters had stopped moving. Because this wasn't something you captured in shorthand. This was something you witnessed. My father's attorney opened his mouth, closed it. Tried again. Your Honor, with respect, this is highly irregular. Personal testimony of this nature is admissible, she said, when it directly addresses the credibility of the claims being made. She stepped back then, but not behind the bench. Not yet. And if you require documentation, she added, you will receive it. As if on cue, the courtroom doors opened. The sound was quiet, but in that silence it carried. A clerk entered, moving quickly, but without urgency, a sealed envelope in hand. Delivery for the court, he said. The judge nodded. The envelope was placed on the bench. She didn't open it immediately. She looked at my father. Really looked at him. Not as a plaintiff. As a man. You have asked this court to determine whether your daughter is who she claims to be, she said. Her voice had returned to its formal cadence. Controlled, precise. But there was something under it now. Something that hadn't been there before. You have asserted repeatedly and publicly that she has constructed an identity based on fabrication. A pause. And you have done so with conviction. She opened the envelope. Paper slid free. Official. Stamped, marked in a way that didn't belong to civilian systems. These documents, she said, scanning them briefly, have been released under an emergency declassification order, authorized within the last 12 hours. A ripple moved through the room. Sharp this time. Uncontained. Service records, she continued. Deployment logs, commendations, chain of command verification. She lifted one page slightly. And a field report bearing the signature of the commanding officer present at the Kandahar incident in question. Her eyes lifted, which aligns with the testimony I have just provided. My father didn't move, not immediately, but something in his posture had changed. The certainty, gone, replaced by something harder to name. Not disbelief, recognition, the kind that comes too late. You asked for proof, she said one last time. Her gaze didn't leave his. You have it. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. Of everything that had just been said. Of everything that could no longer be unsaid. I didn't smile. I didn't speak. I just exhaled. Slowly. Carefully. As if I had been holding something in place for years, and had finally been given permission to let it go. The robe lay where she had left it, folded into nothing. Authority momentarily set aside. Truth standing in its place. And across the room my father sat very still. For the first time in my life he looked like a man who had run out of ways to control what came next. The ruling itself didn't come with drama. No gavel slammed, no raised voices, no moment crafted for spectacle. Judge Marion Vale returned to the bench, the robe back in place, not as concealment, but as structure. The room shifted with her reforming around the familiar lines of procedure. But something essential had already changed. You could feel it in the way no one leaned back into comfort. The case was dismissed with prejudice. The words were precise, final, not just a loss for the plaintiff, but a closure of the path he had chosen. There would be no refiling. No second attempt to reshape the narrative through a different angle. My father's version of me had just been denied the one thing he trusted most: legal permanence. There was a brief discussion of potential sanctions language, about abuse of process, reputational harm, the misuse of the court as an instrument of personal correction. His attorney tried to recover ground, to reframe the intention as concern, as confusion, as a family matter taken too far. It didn't land. The judge listened, acknowledged, then moved forward. There are moments when a system reveals exactly what it can and cannot do. It could clear my name. It could not repair what had been broken long before we entered that room. People began to move. Chairs shifted, papers gathered, the low murmur of voices returning tentative at first, then more certain as the structure of the courtroom reasserted itself. A young woman in uniform stood near the aisle, her posture straight, her expression composed. When I stepped past her, she raised her hand in a quiet, respectful salute. I returned it with a nod. Nothing more. Nothing needed. Behind me, someone whispered my name, not loudly, not for attention, but as if confirming it existed. Elena Whitmore. For a long time, hearing it in public had felt like exposure. Now it felt neutral, like something that no longer required defense. I didn't wait for my father to approach. I didn't look for him. But as I reached the doors, I felt it, the shift in the air that comes when someone is watching you with intention. I paused, not out of obligation, out of clarity. Then I turned. He was still seated. The room had emptied around him in a way that made the space feel larger than it was. My mother sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her posture unchanged, though her eyes had lost their usual focus. My father's gaze met mine. For a moment, neither of us spoke. There were 1,000 things he could have said. Explanations, justifications, a version of apology that never quite used the word. He had always been good with language, always able to shape it into something that sounded reasonable even when it wasn't. But now there was nothing left to shape. "You made this public," he said finally. Not loud, not angry, just a statement. As if that were the part he couldn't reconcile. I held his gaze. "No," I said, "you did." The silence that followed wasn't sharp. It was hollow. He looked at me for a second longer, as if searching for something he recognized. Then he nodded. Once. A small movement. Not agreement. Not acceptance. Just acknowledgement that the conversation, whatever it had been, was over. I didn't wait for more. I turned and walked out. Outside, the air was thick with late afternoon heat. Humidity pressed against my skin, grounding in a way the sterile cold of the courtroom never could be. Reporters had gathered near the steps, microphones, cameras, questions already forming in their posture before they were spoken. "Captain Whitmore, do you have a statement? Can you respond to the allegations?" I kept walking. Not because I didn't have answers, because I didn't need to give them here. Not anymore. The truth had already arrived. It didn't require amplification. That night, I stood in my apartment, the window cracked just enough to let the city's distant noise filter in. A siren somewhere far off. The low hum of traffic. Life continuing in a rhythm that had nothing to do with what had happened that day. I poured a glass of water, set it down, and let the quiet settle. I had imagined this moment before. The end of it. What it would feel like to have everything laid out, confirmed, validated. I thought it would feel like victory. It didn't. It felt like absence. Like something that had occupied too much space for too long had finally been removed. Not replaced. Just gone. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived. Heavy paper, my father's handwriting. I recognized it before I opened it. Inside, the language was exactly what I expected. Measured, formal. There was mention of regret, of misinterpretation, of the complexities of family dynamics under pressure. He signed it. Daniel Whitmore. No dad. No attempt to bridge the distance. Just a name. The same way he had addressed me in the lawsuit. I read the first paragraph, then I stopped, folded the paper, and set it aside. Not out of anger. Out of understanding. Some people don't apologize. They revise. And I was no longer interested in revisions. I moved 3 months later. A small house in western North Carolina just beyond the edge of a forest that seemed to breathe on its own. The kind of place where the air changed with the time of day, where silence wasn't empty, but full of small steady sounds, whined through trees, water moving somewhere you couldn't quite see. I found work at a regional veterans clinic. No title on the door. No nameplate. Just Elena. Most of the people who came through didn't ask about my past. They didn't need to. They carried their own. The smell of diesel that made someone pause mid-sentence, the way a sudden noise shifted a room without explanation, the quiet understanding that some stories are told in fragments and some are never spoken at all. I listened. Sometimes that was enough. One evening after a long day, I stepped outside and sat on the bench I had built behind the house. The sky was clear. Stars, sharp and unfiltered, spread across it in a way you don't see in cities. I held a photograph in my hand. Grainy, old. Me kneeling beside a vehicle that no longer existed, my hands stained my expression set in a way I barely recognized. In the corner, barely legible. Vale. She had sent it without a note. No explanation. She didn't need one. I placed the photo on the small shelf inside above the fireplace. Not next to medals. Not as a display. Just where I could see it. A reminder. Not of what I had proven. Of what I had lived. I don't measure time the same way anymore. Not by deployments. Not by court dates. Not by the absence of calls that never came. I measure it by quieter things now. How long the light lingers on the porch in late afternoon. The shift in the wind before a storm. The way my name feels when I say it out loud. Elena Whitmore. Not as something I have to defend. As something that simply is. My father never called. I don't know if he read the full ruling. I don't know if he understands what he did, or if he's found a version of the story that lets him keep moving without looking too closely. It doesn't matter. Closure isn't always an apology. Sometimes it's the absence of the need for one. If you've ever had someone try to rewrite who you are quietly, persistently, until even you start to question it, then you understand something most people don't. The truth doesn't always arrive loudly. It doesn't always come with recognition or applause. Sometimes it shows up in a room where no one expects it and refuses to leave. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever had to stand still while someone else tried to define your life for you, I'd like to hear where you're listening from. Leave a comment. Share your thoughts. There are more stories like this. Stories about truth, about silence, about the moments that change everything in ways no one sees coming. Subscribe if you want to stay with us. We're just getting started.